Hey guys, tonight we're going back, way back, to an era drenched in myth, mud and medieval disappointment. You're about to become a knight. That sounds cool, right? Galloping through misty fields in shining armour, waving gallantly at villagers while some lute music swells in the background? Yeah, no, a reality check. You probably won't survive this, and even if you do, you'll end up broke, infected, and smelling like a fermented goat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is, especially if you're half asleep already. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all starts when you're 7, you're just a kid. You've probably just learned how to tie your hose properly without tripping over your own legs. You've maybe started climbing trees without crying halfway up. And just as you're finally getting comfy at home, someone important looking on a horse shows up at your family's humble hall. You're barely old enough to remember what they told you this morning, but you're about to be ripped from everything familiar. The noble lord your family owes allegiance to has summoned you to begin training as a page. A page is not an assistant. It's not even an apprentice. It's more like a medieval gopher. Your job is to run errands, carry stuff, fetch water, and be invisible unless spoken to. You're packed up with a few belongings, a wooden sword if you're lucky, and sent off to the lord's castle. The goodbyes are short and awkward. Nobody gets too emotional because people die young, and goodbyes are a regular part of life. Your mother probably tells you not to shame the family, and your father grunts something vaguely approving like, "Don't drop the sword." Your new home is massive, echoey, and cold. The stone walls are always damp. Everything smells like smoke, sweat, and something long dead that nobody's been able to locate. You're one of several young boys crammed into a cramped dormitory with hay-stuffed mattresses and exactly zero privacy. Your blanket smells like the last kid who used it, and he had a lice problem. Your day begins at dawn, not sunrise, dawn, like that grey, pre-sunlight horror that makes you question if time is even real. You're expected to be up, dressed, and semi-functional before the cockerel has even bothered to crow. Breakfast is thin porridge and stale bread. If you get butter, someone important must be visiting. You start the day cleaning your lord's armour with vinegar and sand, and yes, if you scratch it, you're dead. Or worse, reassigned to mucking out the latrines. Learning manners is a big part of page life. You get smacked if you forget to bow properly, or if you serve wine with the wrong hand, or if you trip over your own feet during a ceremonial procession. There's an entire system of rules about how to address people depending on how many generations their family has been noble. You're 7. You still forget your left from your right. And now you have to remember that Sir Ulrich of the Marshlands is 2 ranks above Sir Geoff of the Bog, but 1 below Baron Maurice of the slightly larger marsh. You also start your physical training, mostly BS. This means swinging a wooden sword that's somehow heavier than a real one, trying to ride horses that sense your fear like bloodhounds, and getting knocked flat on your face during wrestling practice. Your bruises have bruises. Your instructor, a retired knight missing 3 fingers and half an ear, delights in yelling at you to fight like you mean it, even though your legs barely work and you're still crying from where a horse stepped on your foot. Occasionally, you're sent to observe the older squires as they train. You watch as they spar with real steel and think, "Oh, wow, that'll be me someday." Then one of them takes a sword to the shoulder and crumples like wet laundry, and suddenly you're not so sure. There's no mercy rule in medieval training. You fall, you get up, you cry, you're told to cry quieter. Every once in a while, a guest visits, a noblewoman in impossibly clean robes, or a foreign knight with a falcon perched on his shoulder, and you get a glimpse of the glamour. This is when the illusions kick in. Maybe all this suffering leads somewhere. Maybe you'll get a sword forged just for you. Maybe you'll ride into battle and have songs written about you. But mostly, you're just trying not to drop the tray of boiled goose legs you're carrying, while avoiding eye contact with the surly kitchen staff. Now here's a historical fact to lodge in your brain while you try to fall asleep. Most knights didn't even get formal training until they were lucky enough to be born into the right class. This whole start at 7 thing? It was only for the sons of the upper crust. Regular folks, they were out digging turnips, not fencing with birchwood blades. Quirky aside, it wasn't uncommon for these young pages to carry love notes between nobles, medieval wingmen before Tinder. Occasionally those notes were written in hilariously bad French-Latin hybrids that no one actually understood, not even the people who wrote them. And then there's the ongoing debate among scholars about whether page training was genuinely brutal or just exaggerated later. by nostalgic chroniclers with nothing better to do. Some argue it was more structured and kind than we assume. Others point out that these were the same centuries where people thought leeches were medicine. So, you tell me. By the time you finally drift off to your flea-ridden straw mat, your limbs ache, and your head is spinning from trying to remember 17 different ways to bow, and you're already dreading tomorrow, and you're still just a page. You haven't even made it to the hard part yet. The days blur together. At this point, you're not even sure what month it is. The calendar doesn't matter much. Your life is ruled by chores, not seasons. Welcome to the next several years of your life, pagehood. The novelty has worn off. There's no more wide-eyed wonder about castles or lords or the possibility of one day owning your own sword. Instead, your hands are blistered from polishing boots and scrubbing floors, your knees ache from bowing every 5 minutes, and your back is permanently sore from hauling buckets up narrow staircases built by people who apparently didn't believe in symmetry or mercy. And you know what the worst part is? The sheer, unrelenting monotony. Medieval life for a page is not some whimsical adventure. It's mostly just labour. Menial, repetitive, soul-draining labour. You wake up, do your assigned chores, cleaning armour, setting the dining hall, fetching firewood, sweeping the chapel. Then you report to your master's chamber and hope he's not in a mood. If he is, congratulations, now you're the target of his bad temper, and probably have to recite your genealogy backwards while standing on one foot. If he's not, you might get 5 minutes to yourself before someone else finds you something else to clean. Let's talk about the food. Not terrible, but not great either. You eat at a separate table, way off to the side, after the nobles are done, which means your stew is usually cold and your bread has seen better decades. On feast days, things perk up a little. There's roasted meat, maybe even a bit of fruit, but most of that goes to the lords and ladies. You might get the gristly leftovers if you're lucky. There's no silverware unless you're nobility, so you get used to using your fingers and trying not to look too desperate as you either meat on someone else's plate. Manners training never stops. Every gesture is judged, every slip remembered. You're taught how to carry a goblet without sloshing wine, how to hold a napkin just so, how to speak only when spoken to, and always with just the right amount of subservient humility. Your lessons are part finishing school, part psychological warfare. Smile too little, you're sullen. Smile too much, you're simple. There's a sweet spot, and it's always shifting, like the floor during a castle feast after everyone's had too much ale. You're also expected to learn how to read, if you're lucky, and to play a musical instrument. This isn't for your enrichment. This is so you can entertain your betters without being an embarrassment. The lute, the harp, maybe a little flute. Don't play well. Get ready for public humiliation. Because nothing goes better with a roast swan than watching a 7-year-old fumble through green sleeves while sweating bullets. And horses. Let's talk about horses. Your relationship with them is, at best, strained. You're expected to learn how to ride, groom, feed, and saddle them. No one tells you that warhorses are barely trained murder beasts with hooves. You try to approach one with an apple, hoping for a Disney moment, and instead it nearly kicks your jaw off. You quickly learn to avoid eye contact. The stable master, missing 3 teeth and perpetually drunk, tells you, they smell fear. You believe him. You carry messages too. Between the castle and neighbouring estates. Sounds simple, right? Except you're a child galloping through dense forest or muddy roads while avoiding thieves, wolves, and the occasional angry peasant who thinks you're a tax collector. Oh boy. Sometimes, if the message is especially sensitive, you're told to memorize it instead of carrying a scroll. Which is great, because there's nothing like the stress of possibly dooming your lord's political alliance because you forgot which earl was marrying which count's niece. Here's a fun historical fact. Pages were often trained in falconry. That's right, handling birds of prey was considered an essential noble skill. You'd be expected to learn how to care for a bird that could remove your finger if you annoyed it. You have to feed it raw meat, coax it onto your arm, and learn to launch it into the sky with just the right wrist flick. It looks majestic when done properly. When you try it, the hawk just flaps into your face and then vomits on your sleeve. Now for something a little weird. It wasn't uncommon for pages to sleep in the same room, or even the same bed, as their noble masters, supposedly to be nearby in case they were needed. Sounds honourable until you realise it means sharing a bed with a middle-aged knight who snores like a warhorn and occasionally kicks in his sleep. And here's a debate historians can't stop arguing about. How rigid was this training, really? Some claim that pagehood was strictly enforced, with clear ranks, stages and expectations. Others suggest that it varied wildly depending on region, wealth, and who your lord was. If your master was kind, rare, you might get proper instruction. If not, you might just become a glorified servant who occasionally gets whacked with a stick for standing incorrectly. You might think there's an end in sight, but this phase lasts until you're about 14. That's 7 years of servitude, scoldings, and social anxiety masquerading as discipline. Your body changes, puberty hits, which is confusing enough without being in a tunic surrounded by other equally confused boys who all reek of unwashed feet and horse. Your voice cracks during choir practice. You develop crushes on noble women you'll never speak to, and you start to realise that being a knight might not be the glamorous life the songs promised. At night, you lie on your straw mattress, thinner, now full of suspicious crawling things, and stare at the wooden beams above your head. You wonder if your parents miss you. You wonder if they even remember to write. You wonder if they gave your younger brother your room. And then you dream of armour that doesn't chafe, horses that don't try to murder you, and a future where maybe, just maybe, you get to swing a real sword at someone instead of a broom at a cobweb. So you've made it through pagehood without dying of embarrassment, dysentery, or a rogue hawk attack. Congratulations, you're now a squire, aka the medieval equivalent of an unpaid intern with a 95% chance of head trauma. You're about 14 now, which in this era means you're practically a man, ready to be tossed headfirst into a whole new level of pain, pressure, and plate armour. Your duties as a squire? Oh, just everything. You're now personally assigned to a knight, ideally a noble one with a reputation for not stabbing his own men by accident. You serve him day and night. That means helping him dress, cleaning his armour, still your job, sorry, feeding his horse, sharpening his weapons, and waking up when he wakes up, even if that's at some unholy hour because he had a dream about glory and now wants to practice his war cry at sunrise. You're also expected to be his shadow on the battlefield. Not fighting yet, though. Your job is to carry extra weapons, retrieve his lost sword if he drops it mid-duel, and drag him off the ground if someone knocks him off his horse. Picture this: arrows flying, bodies falling, chaos everywhere, and you're dodging through the carnage with a shield and a spare lance, trying not to cry or die. Romantic, right? Training becomes your full-time job. You fight every day now, actual steel, actual bruises. You learn to wield a longsword, a dagger, a mace and a polearm, and you're expected to do it with technique and flair. Your instructor, probably a one-eyed veteran whose teaching style is trial by blood. He doesn't believe in helmets during training. He says it dulls your instincts. It also dulls your skull. But that's a you problem. Let's talk about the bruises. You are at any given time a walking mosaic of them. Your arms, ribs, thighs, covered in the purple signatures of daily beatings. No one asks how you are. No one cares if your wrist hurts or your ankle's swollen. You walk it off. If you complain, you're called soft. If you cry, someone might throw a gauntlet at you just to give you something to really cry about. Also, you're now officially a horse person, not because you like them, because you have no choice. You're responsible for the knight's warhorse, which is even meaner than the one you trained with as a page. It bites, it kicks. It once dragged a guy 50 feet because he sneezed while putting the bridle on. You spend hours grooming it, cleaning its hooves, feeding it oats you could have eaten yourself, and whispering prayers that it doesn't trample you before battle. And the armour. Oh boy, the armour. You don't have your own yet, but you practice in second-hand pieces that barely fit. Some bits are too loose, others pinch in places you didn't know could pinch. You train to run, roll, kneel, and mount a horse in steep pounds of steel strapped to your body. You think you'll get used to it, but you don't. You just sweat until your skin feels like it's cooking inside a tin can. It smells like rust, old sweat, and wet wool. It smells like fear. Now here's a cold historical fact. The average squire could spend up to 7 years in this role. That's 7 more years of fetching, bleeding, obeying, and desperately hoping your knight doesn't get impaled before he recommends you for knighthood. If he dies before that, tough luck. You're basically starting over with a new knight who may or may not hate you on sight. A fun little sequel fringe fact. Squires were often expected to sleep in their knight's tent during campaigns. Not because it was cosy, because you were basically a walking alarm system. If someone snuck in to assassinate your knight in the night, congratulations, you get murdered first. You're the medieval tripwire. You don't even get a bedroll of your own most times, just a corner near the armour pile and a hope that rats don't chew your toes off. And then there's the scholarly debate that rages quietly in the dusty corners of academia. How much agency did squires really have? Were they simply servants with aspirations, or young nobles undergoing legitimate mentorship? Some argue the knight-squire relationship was like a father and son. Others point out that most of the father figures had tempers, concubines, and drinking problems. Interpret that bond however you want. What's even more charming is that despite being technically nobility in training, you're still treated like a glorified errand boy. The kitchen staff sends you to fetch barrels. The steward assigns you to chop firewood. The lady of the castle might hand you her embroidery basket and ask you to carry it through the rain without getting it wet. If you object, that's adorable. Now go clean the chamber pots too. But don't worry, there are perks. Every now and then you get to attend feasts, not as a guest of course, as a silent, underfed accessory standing behind your knight's chair. Still, you get to hear music, see dancers, smell roasted meats you won't taste, and watch nobles flirt awkwardly across the table. Occasionally, if you're really lucky, a bored noblewoman will smile at you and whisper something scandalous, which will fuel your dreams for months. Romance, of course, is off limits. You're supposed to focus on honour, duty, and not tripping over your scabbard. But you're 16 now and your hormones are louder than the war drums. You start composing terrible poetry in your head and nearly fall off your horse when a servant girl smiles at you. Your knight finds a note you tried to deliver and punishes you by assigning you latrine duty for a week. You're covered in the worst humanity has to offer, and still can't stop thinking about her freckles. You're growing stronger, faster, and maybe a little smarter. You've stopped crying during training mostly. You can parry a blade without flinching, ride at a gallop, and fix a broken saddle with one hand while eating stale cheese with the other. But you're also tired. Deep down, soul-weary tired. You sleep like the dead, but wake with your teeth still clenched. And through it all, you hold on to that distant hope. One day you'll be knighted. One day you'll be the one swinging the sword instead of picking it up from the mud. One day someone else will be wiping your boots and patching your chainmail, but not yet. One morning, after what feels like 100 years of being everyone's favourite target for orders, kicks and a blame, your knight finally calls you into his chamber, not to berate you for forgetting to oil his gauntlets, but to tell you the time has come. You're going to be knighted, just like that. No drum roll, no soaring music, no sudden burst of confidence. Just a tired old man in chainmail grunting that you're not completely useless anymore. You want to celebrate, scream, cry, or maybe sleep for a week. But you nod, bow, and try not to look like you're about to pass out. Now, being knighted is supposed to be a sacred ritual steeped in tradition, honour, and holiness. In theory, there's a bath to purify your body, a vigil where you spend the night praying in a chapel beside your sword, and a ceremonial dubbing by your lord or king where you're finally told to rise, Sir You. That's the brochure version. In reality, your bath is a cold bucket in the stables, your vigil is cut short by a rat crawling over your boot, and the ceremonial dubbing is held on a muddy field after your lord realises he needs another blade in the next skirmish and you're the least injured option. Still, it happens. You kneel, you get smacked lightly on the shoulder with a sword by someone only half awake. You rise, you're a knight, and within 5 minutes you're realising what a terrible mistake this might have been. Because here's what no one tells you. Now that you're a knight, your responsibilities go up, but your salary doesn't. You're now expected to supply your own armour, your own weapons, your own horse, and usually your own retainers. And guess what? You're broke. All that training, unpaid. All those years of serving nobles and fetching swords, also unpaid. You've got nothing but your slightly warped training sword and a second-hand suit of chainmail that smells like the last 3 people who wore it before dying violently. A decent suit of armour costs the medieval equivalent of a small villa. A warhorse? More than your family's farm. And that's not including the saddlebags, the tent, the heraldic surcoat, because now you have to look respectable, the shield with your new coat of arms, and of course a decent longsword. Suddenly, you're in debt up to your very high, very metal neck. Your only real option is to borrow money from your lord or some sketchy local moneylender who makes you sign something in Latin and smirks the whole time. Oh, and speaking of armour, let's talk about the sheer hell of wearing it. It looks cool, sure. You glint in the sun like a tin lantern, but it's also incredibly heavy, awkward and noisy. You squeak and clank with every step like a walking pantry full of pots, and it's hot, like unforgivably hot. Once you're fully armoured up, you begin to cook in your own sweat. Your undergarments, called a gambeson, are thick, padded, and designed to absorb impact. Unfortunately, they also absorb every drop of your misery and body odour. You can't scratch anything under all that steel, If your nose itches, too bad. If something crawls into your greaves, good luck. You'd think the armour would make you feel invincible, but mostly it just makes you feel like a really well-decorated prisoner. Try walking across a field in 60 pounds of metal and wool on a summer day, then getting on a horse without collapsing into a puddle of your own regrets. Here's a fun historical tidbit to make it worse. Knights often had their armour custom made to fit their bodies perfectly, but most knights couldn't afford that. So you're walking around in piecemeal protection, like a medieval Mr. Potato Head. Your gauntlets are too tight, your helmet doesn't quite sit straight, and your breastplate was clearly designed for someone with a completely different build. Probably someone who actually had shoulders, and here's the real kicker, you're now expected to maintain this absurdly expensive gear yourself. That means scrubbing every inch after battle to prevent rust. If you neglect it, the whole thing can degrade shockingly fast. And let's not even get into the joy of finding fleas in your chainmail. Yes, fleas. Turns out cloth padding and long marches are a buffet for parasites. You scratch at your armpits like a man possessed while trying to act chivalrous at a feast. But hey, at least you get to fight now, right? Well, kind of. You're sent out with a small force to patrol your lord's lands, which mostly involves intimidating peasants into paying taxes and occasionally scaring off bandits who scatter the moment you clank into view. You spend a lot of time on horseback, trying not to fall asleep in your saddle or die of thigh chafing. And guess what? You don't get paid regularly. You're supposed to earn your fortune through land, gifts from your lord, or drumroll plunder. Yep, good old-fashioned looting. If your side wins a battle, you get to scavenge weapons, armour, and maybe even ransom prisoners if they're wealthy. That's assuming you survive, of course, and assuming you're not stabbed in the back by some other knight trying to beat you to the spoils. The chivalric code says you're supposed to be noble, honourable, and just. The battlefield says, first come, first stab. And speaking of the chivalric code, here's the scholarly debate. Was it ever actually followed? Or was it just propaganda written by poets who needed a way to sell stories about men who usually just killed people for money? Some say it was a genuine moral framework that guided knightly behaviour. Others say it was a PR stunt, basically medieval branding. The same knight who professes to defend the innocent might also burn down a village because someone insulted his banner. Also, remember that loan you took out to buy your armour and horse? Yeah, interest is due. If you can't pay it back, your armour might get repossessed. Imagine that, being unknighted by a guy with a clipboard and a bad attitude. If your lord is generous, he might forgive some of the debt in exchange for loyalty and service. If not, you might find yourself in debtor's prison. Or worse, farming turnips in disgrace. So here you are, a knight at last, sweltering in metal, broke beyond belief and increasingly suspicious that this whole career path may have been a colossal mistake. You don't feel heroic. You feel tired. But you slap on your helmet, climb back onto your glowering warhorse and ride off into the smelly, humid, financially precarious sunset. Now that you're officially a knight, and officially poor, you get to spend most of your waking hours inside your very own personalised sweatbox, armour. You might have dreamed of walking through the village with the sun bouncing majestically off your polished breastplate, peasants cheering, birds singing. What you get instead is heatstroke, chafing in places you can't talk about in church, and a helmet that makes everything echo like you're shouting inside a soup pot. Let's break this down. A full suit of plate armour can weigh anywhere from 45 to 60 pounds. That doesn't sound too bad, right? Try wearing it for 10 hours while riding a horse that actively dislikes you, then dismounting and attempting to jog through ankle-deep mud while archers take pot shots at you from behind a hedge. You don't walk like a fearsome warrior, you clomp, you wobble, you fall over, and then you lie there for a moment wondering if you can just pretend to be dead until the fighting stops. Getting into the armour is a whole production. It can't be done alone, not unless you've got 3 arms and the patience of a saint. You need a squire or 2 to strap, buckle, cinch and hammer everything into place. It's like being dressed by a pit crew. One wrong strap and the whole system feels off. Your breastplate digs into your collarbone. Your greaves twist so your knees lock. Your gauntlets are so stiff you can't even scratch your nose, which of course starts itching the moment you're fully sealed in. And the smell, dear God, the smell. Imagine layering thick padding, then chainmail, then steel, all of it absorbing your sweat day after day. The gambeson beneath your armour starts to smell like wet hay and spoiled broth within a week. There's no such thing as laundry day. If you're lucky, you hang it over a fire to air out, which mostly just gives it a smoky, slightly roasted stench. It's like living inside a meat locker that someone's been using as a gym. Plus, nobody talks about the noise. Armour isn't set. Every step is a series of clanks, creaks and rattles. It's like wearing a percussion section. You can't sneak anywhere. You approach a fight sounding like a drunk ironworker falling down a staircase. You know who can sneak? Peasants with pitchforks and no metal on their feet. You know what they do when they hear you coming. Hide, circle around and stab you somewhere really inconvenient. Here's a cheerful historical fact for you. Many knights didn't wear full plate for everyday skirmishes. It was too cumbersome. Instead, they wore pieces of plate over mail, like shoulder pauldrons and a breastplate, keeping their mobility without committing fully to becoming a walking oven. Full suits were saved for tournaments, major battles, and portraits meant to impress royal daughters who'd never have to wear anything heavier than a velvet gown. But say you're stuck in full armour on a summer's day, you're sweating like a pig in a foundry, your padding's soaked, your helmet is funneling hot air back into your face, and your visor fogs up every time you breathe. You lift it to get some air and immediately swallow a fly. You try to spit it out, but the spit just runs down inside your chin guard and collects near your collarbone. Oh! And movement? Good luck. You can barely turn your head. Sitting is weird. Mounting your horse is a clumsy shuffle, where you desperately hope your squire shoves you hard enough to actually land in the saddle. Dismounting is even more fun. It's less graceful slide and more controlled fall with a prayer. Once you're on the ground, you try to walk normally, but your knees don't fully bend, your arms swing like a wind-up toy, and if you trip, well, we'll get to that horror in a future section. You'd think wearing armour would make you feel safe. Not really. You know exactly where your weak points are. The armpits, the groin, behind the knees, under the chin. Everyone does. And every peasant with a dagger knows to aim for them. You get paranoid. You hunch, constantly checking your flanks, rotating your shoulders like a crab. Your back itches and you can't reach it. You think you might be losing your mind. Now here's a lovely little quirky fact. Some knights had to relieve themselves while still in armour. That's right. There's no bathroom break during a charge. If battle is raging, you do what you have to do. There are actual accounts of knights soiling themselves mid-fight and just carrying on. So glamorous. You always imagined your heroic legacy. Turns out it's mostly held together by bodily fluids and iron pins. And as for scholarly debates, historians have long argued about just how restrictive armour really was. Some modern recreations show that well-fitted plate allows for surprising mobility. You can run, jump, even not roll, but these reconstructions use tailored pieces and properly trained wearers. For the average knight scrambling to afford mismatched armour while eating pickled onions and bread crusts, the experience was probably a lot closer to suffocating inside a garbage can while being chased. Let's not forget the psychological toll. Armour becomes your second skin and you start to feel wrong without it. Naked, vulnerable. You develop this weird identity where you're only worth something when you're armoured up, glinting in the sun, sword in hand. And when you're not, you're just a guy, with bruises, debt and thinning hair. Armour maintenance is a nightmare all its own. Every piece has to be cleaned and oiled constantly or it rusts. A single week of neglect and your beautiful polished gear starts to look like an abandoned kettle. If you're on campaign, you do it by firelight, using rags and elbow grease while someone nearby boils questionable stew in a dented pot. And heaven help you if you forget a piece on the field after battle. Someone will loot it faster than you can say, wait. You try not to think about how much it cost, how much you owe, that this helmet pressing into your forehead represents years of repayments, political favours and whispered threats. You tell yourself it's worth it, that armour makes the knight, that your name carries weight now, but deep down, while trudging through some muddy bug-ridden field, your visor fogging up again, you start to wonder if this shiny cage was ever really freedom at all. If the armour hasn't broken you yet, don't worry, your horse will finish the job, because now that you're a proper knight, you don't just have a horse, you are a horseman. That's a title people throw around like it's something to be proud of, but let's get something very clear. Your warhorse doesn't love you. It doesn't even like you. It tolerates your existence with the cold, dead-eyed indifference of an apex predator that knows it could end you with one badly timed kick. This is no sweet storybook pony. Your warhorse, usually a destrier if you're rich, or a cobbled-together mutt breed if you're broke, is a living siege weapon. These horses are bred to be massive, powerful and terrifying. Some stand nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder, muscles rippling under their thick necks, eyes full of barely contained rage. Getting on one is less like riding and more like trying to sit comfortably on a very fast, very angry dinner table. You spend more time grooming this beast than you do bathing yourself. You brush its coat, clean its hooves, pick out burrs, check its shoes, and feed it better meals than you're getting. Warm oats, sometimes mixed with honey, maybe apples. Meanwhile, you're chewing dry bread, staring wistfully at the bucket of feed like it's a 5-star buffet. You polish its tack and saddle like your life depends on it, because it does. One poorly tied girth strap and you're flying off sideways during a charge. The horse knows this, by the way. It knows you depend on it, and it does not care. It bites. It fakes lameness to avoid training. It refuses to move unless you coax it with just the right mix of flattery and bribery. And the moment you let your guard down, it steps on your foot with the precision of someone who's definitely done that before and enjoyed it. Mounting is its own circus act. You haul yourself up using the stirrup, trying not to flash everyone in the process, and then spend a full minute adjusting your body because you've landed wrong and something's now poking you in a place that should never be poked by chainmail. Once you're finally upright and balanced, your warhorse takes 2 steps sideways into a bush and acts like it's never seen a leaf before. Now, once you get moving, things do feel majestic for about 12 seconds. Galloping in armour is cinematic in theory. In practice, it's an earthquake with saddle sores. The jostling alone is enough to make you reconsider ever having children. You bounce, you sway, you brace, you regret everything. And the worst part? You're expected to fight like this. Lances, swords, and even axes, all while clinging to the back of a creature with the attention span of a gnat and the ego of a myrmidon. Here's a historical nugget to chew on. Warhorses were trained to kick, bite, and trample enemies on command. That's right, they were weaponized. You thought jousting was dangerous? Try riding into battle on 1,000 pounds of muscle that's also trying to murder people. You're supposed to guide it with your knees, your voice, and a kind of telepathic link developed through years of bonding. Problem is, you and your horse hate each other, so it mostly ignores you until it sees something shiny and bolts in the wrong direction. Quirky side note, knights didn't usually name their warhorses Thunder or Shadowfax or anything cool, no. It was stuff like Garland, Grizz or Flambard, which sound more like antique lamps or failed French appetizers. And while you want to name yours something heroic like Bloodbane, it responds better to Stumpy because that's what the stable boys have been calling it for years. You're too tired to fight it. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about just how versatile these horses really were. Some experts argue that destriers were basically useless outside of war, too expensive to maintain, too temperamental for daily use. Others insist they were the knight's best friend, his most valuable asset, trained to respond to dozens of battlefield cues. Both sides agree on one thing: these horses were not easy rides. They required constant care, endless amounts of patience, and a tolerance for being thrown off roughly once a week. And let's not forget how much they cost. A good warhorse is worth several years of wages. If yours gets injured or sick, you can't exactly pop down to the local vet. You might send for an equine healer, but that's just a guy who rubs garlic on the horse's legs and says a prayer. If the horse dies, you're financially ruined and have to walk home in full armour, clanking the whole way while children throw cabbage at you. Of course, horses are also temperamental in battle. Loud noises, flying arrows, fire. These things unsettle even the best trained steed. Your destrier might charge nobly into a phalanx, or it might stop dead, rear up and dump you unceremoniously on the ground, where a pikeman is already lining up his next move. Once you're down, good luck getting back up. Your horse is now galloping off into the forest and your dignity is trailing behind it like a broken lance. And here's the final insult. Despite all the hours you spend feeding, grooming and whispering sweet nothings to this hoofed maniac, your horse will never love you. No night horse bonding montage, no teary goodbye in the rain. Just a constant game of survival where you both pretend to respect each other, but secretly hope the other one steps on a rake. By the time you've been a knight for a few years, your back is ruined. Your thighs are permanently sore, and your knees creak when you climb into the saddle. You start to envy the foot soldiers with their cheap boots and less complicated relationships. At least they don't need to spend 2 hours every day brushing something that might bite their fingers off for fun. You once dreamed of being the kind of knight who rode into town, cape billowing, horse prancing, armour gleaming. But now, you're hunched forward, swearing under your breath, trying to keep your saddle from sliding sideways because your girth strap broke again. The peasants don't look impressed. They mostly look afraid you'll trample their chickens. And honestly, you might. There's a certain moment, usually around the second week of a campaign, When you haven't changed your undergarments and you smell like something that washed up on the shore of a cursed lake. When you realise the true horror of medieval nightlife, hygiene, or more accurately, the catastrophic absence of it. You once imagined knights as clean, well-groomed warriors, polished and perfumed, maybe with a noble scar or two for flavour. But here in the grimy guts of reality, you're a walking biohazard in boots. Let's start with your underlayers, the gambeson, hose and shirt you wear beneath the armour. These are meant to protect your skin and cushion blows. They're thick, they're quilted, they're warm, too warm. After a day of marching, fighting, or even just sitting in the sun, they're completely soaked through with sweat. But here's the kicker. You don't have a spare set. Maybe, you have one backup that smells marginally less like regret, but laundry isn't exactly a priority on the front lines, so you keep wearing the same sour layers until they can nearly stand up on their own. Removing your gear at the end of the day is its own miserable ritual. The armour comes off in stages, each piece heavy, sticky and groaning like it also wants to quit this job. By the time you get to the padded garments underneath, you're peeling them off like old wallpaper, moist, clinging, and full of unpleasant surprises. One day you'll find a tick. Another day, it'll be a rash that wasn't there this morning. And occasionally you'll discover a patch of skin that's gone raw and red from constant friction. Now technically, you're supposed to wash yourself. Knights are encouraged to stay clean, if only because festering wounds smell bad and offend the nobility. But bathing isn't easy. You need access to a bathhouse or a basin large enough to soak in, and ideally hot water, which usually means bribing the kitchen staff and waiting several hours for someone to boil enough water to fill a half barrel. Most of the time, you settle for splashing your face with cold water, wiping your armpits with a damp cloth, and calling it a day. You tell yourself you're roughing it, as if that's sober. Really, you're just developing an ecosystem in your boots. Speaking of boots, those are nightmares all on their own. You wear them constantly, they're stiff, often mismatched and never quite dry. Your feet stew inside them all day, rubbing against seams, blistering on the sides and swelling from heat. You lose toenails, you develop calluses the size of silver coins, and you're lucky if it doesn't end with trench foot or some mysterious infection no one can pronounce. The best case scenario is numbness. Worst case, a toe turns black and falls off during dinner. Here's a charming historical fact. Medieval medicine believed that bathing too often weakened the body and opened the pores to disease. That's right, too much cleanliness was considered dangerous. So if you're wondering why people smelled like they had been marinating in soup for a week, it's because that was deliberate. You're sweating out evil humours, they said. You're strengthening your constitution, they claimed. Meanwhile, you're trying to scrub off blood, mud, horse snot and something that might have come from a chicken. Let's not skip over dental hygiene. Knights don't have toothbrushes. At best you might have a rag soaked in vinegar, or maybe a twig chewed at one end until it frays enough to scrape your molars. Your breath smells like onions, stale wine, and a touch of internal decay. If a tooth goes bad, you don't see a dentist. You see a guy with pliers and a jug of ale. He tells you to bite down on a stick and look at the horizon. The pain is biblical. Afterward, you're given more ale and told to walk it off. Here's a fun little fringe fact. Some knights wore linen under their helmets to help absorb sweat and keep their hair from matting. It didn't work. The linen got soaked, started to mildew, and clung to your scalp like a second mouldy skin. When you finally peel it off, it takes some of your hair with it. You can try oils or scented herbs, sure, but those are luxuries. Mostly you just embrace the stink. Everyone does. It's not even shameful, it's just medieval. There's scholarly debate, as always, over just how smelly everyone really was. Some argue that nobles bathed more frequently than we think, that they took pride in perfume, in clean robes, and in maintaining a fresh appearance. Others say that's romantic nonsense, that knights smelled like rotten cheese stuffed into a sock and everyone simply tolerated it because there were bigger problems, like plague, war, and wolves. But let's say you do manage to find a stream or a pond. You strip down, awkwardly trying to preserve some dignity, and wade into the frigid water. It's refreshing for about 2 seconds. Then the cold hits. You gasp. You slip. You remember that your last open wound probably wasn't supposed to go underwater. But you scrub anyway, with a rag and a sliver of harsh soap that burns every cut. You rinse. You dry off with your cloak, which smells worse than you do, and you feel almost human for a few precious minutes. Then you put your underlayers back on. They're still damp from yesterday, And you remember, with crushing clarity, that hygiene is not a one-time achievement. It's a Sisyphean battle against sweat, dirt, and biology itself. Your skin is perpetually irritated. You itch. You reek. You've become a human-shaped stew of filth, frustration, and fabric that's trying to kill you. Eventually, you just stop noticing. You smell bad. Your friends smell bad. Everyone smells bad. When a breeze passes through the camp, you can practically hear the stench moving in waves. New squires retch the first few days. You did too once. Now you simply breathe through your mouth and accept that you're no longer a man. You're a meat sack in a steel box, marinating in your own misery. Some nights, as you lie in your sweaty linens with one boot still on because you're too tired to remove it, you remember the poems, the ones about knights, all elegance and grace. You remember how you used to imagine yourself shining like a star in the court of some noble lady. But now, here you are, raw, rashy, and vaguely fungal. No minstrel will sing about that. By now, you've accepted that nothing in your nightly life will ever be glamorous, hygienic, or remotely pleasant. And just when you think the worst is over, that maybe you've adapted to the itch, the stink, and the occasional crushing debt, it hits you. The training never ends. You thought knighthood was the finish line? Nope. It's just the start of an entirely new form of daily punishment disguised as discipline. Every morning starts the same. Before the sun even pokes over the horizon, you're being shouted awake by someone who somehow manages to be both older and angrier than anyone should legally be before breakfast. Your body aches, your knees click like castanets, and your back feels like it was stepped on by a drunken ox. But you get up anyway, because knights don't sleep in. Sleep is for clergy and corpses. Drills begin before your stomach has even remembered how to digest. Sword forms, footwork, mounted combat, lance handling, each with its own unique way of making you feel like you've learned absolutely nothing since your days as a squire. And of course there's sparring. Nothing builds camaraderie quite like getting clocked in the helmet by someone who still holds a grudge from when you accidentally insulted their cousin 2 years ago. You fight until you're dizzy, then you train with your shield until your arm goes numb, and then you do strength exercises because apparently the human body can always be slightly more miserable. The trainer, usually a weather-beaten man with a limp and a beard that contains a family of spiders, shouts at you to strike like you mean it, while cheerfully whacking your calves with a stick every time you misstep. There's something particularly humiliating about being in full armour, drenched in sweat, wheezing like a dying bellows, while being criticised by a man who hasn't worn a cuirass in 20 years, but can still flatten you with one shove. You try to keep your pride intact. You try to pretend that the burning in your thighs is a noble burn, but you mostly just fantasise about sitting down, somewhere, anywhere, a stone, a stump, a pile of hay, just 5 blessed minutes off your feet. Let's pause for a hard historical truth. Even after being knighted, martial training was a lifelong affair. Knights were expected to stay battle-ready, which meant daily practice. There were manuals, forms, even early fighting schools where techniques were passed down like sacred rituals. You couldn't coast on your title. You had to earn your prowess every single day, or risk being killed by someone who trained harder and had fewer joint problems. And this wasn't limited to swordplay. You were also expected to master archery, even if it was unfashionable. Wrestling, grappling, dagger work, and even swimming in full armour, which is about as logical as trying to juggle flaming torches underwater. You train for hours on horseback, learning how to control your destrier with one hand while wielding a blade in the other, and then you do footwork drills until your feet bleed and your legs shake. You're constantly reminded that battles are won by preparation, not by brawn, which is hilarious, because most of the guys winning battles are 7 feet tall and built like barns. You're not. You're average, maybe a little wiry, and you're starting to develop a weird pain in your shoulder that never goes away. Still you practice. You swing, you block, you lose. You get better, slowly, painfully. Let's throw in a fun fringe fact to distract from the misery. Some knights trained using mannequins or swinging targets called quintaines, a rotating arm with a shield on one side and a weight on the other. If you didn't hit the shield correctly, the weight would spin around and whack you in the back of the head. Training with embarrassment and potential concussion, how medieval. There's also hunting, which is technically training, but mostly just an excuse for noblemen to go into the woods, get drunk and stab wild pigs with unnecessarily elaborate spears. You're expected to participate. Tracking, riding at high speeds, throwing javelins. It sharpens your instincts, they say. You mostly just end up with a twisted ankle and a mouthful of dirt after being thrown from your saddle chasing a boar that clearly had no interest in playing by the rules. And the scholarly debate? There's ongoing chatter about whether knights were truly elite fighters or just rich guys with good PR. Some historians argue that their training gave them a genuine edge: tactical skill, physical endurance, battlefield awareness. Others say their wealth bought survival more than skill ever did. After all, who's going to stab the guy with 5 squires and political connections? That's just bad strategy. But the mental toll of constant training is just as exhausting as the physical. There's no time to reflect, no downtime. Every improvement you make is met with a new demand. Now do it faster. Now with your offhand. Now imagine the target is your dishonoured family name. It's never enough. And deep down, you start to realise that it never will be. And just when you think you're too sore to function, you're sent on a patrol, or to a tournament, or into a skirmish with raiders who definitely weren't supposed to be this organised. You mount up, muscles screaming, and try to remember the dozen new techniques you practiced this morning while simultaneously staying alive. One wrong step and all that training won't matter. Steel doesn't care about your intentions. After the action ends, assuming you survive, you return to camp. No congratulations, no medals, just more drills tomorrow. You collapse on your bedroll, your entire body pulsing with fatigue, and stare up at the canvas above your head. Somewhere nearby, a squire is vomiting from exhaustion. Someone's sharpening a blade. Someone else is already practicing footwork. You try to sleep, but your arms twitch from residual tension, and your brain is stuck replaying every mistake you made. That slow parry, that missed foot placement, that moment your horse hesitated. You start to wonder if anyone ever really masters this life, or if you just keep trying until you're too old to hold a sword, and then someone younger replaces you, faster, stronger, and just as terrified. So yeah, the training never ends, and neither does the fear of falling behind. It's raining again, of course it is. The sky's been a constant shade of probably plague-coloured for 3 weeks, and your boots haven't been dry since last Tuesday. You're standing ankle-deep in mud, surrounded by bored soldiers, grumbling sergeants, and half a dozen tents that smell like wet wool and defeat. Welcome to siege warfare, the slowest, most miserable, least glorious part of being a knight. If you were hoping for heroics, charging walls and making dramatic speeches before leaping into action, sorry. It's mostly just waiting, and then dying. Slowly. Let's paint the scene. You've arrived with your lord's retinue to lay siege to a minor castle occupied by someone's rebellious cousin or maybe a tax-dodging baron. It's hard to keep track. What matters is that you're now a part of a large, very grumpy and very wet army parked outside a stone wall that refuses to crumble as easily as the songs promised. You pitched camp a mile away to avoid the archers, which means every trip to the front lines involves slipping, sliding, and occasionally face-planting into a puddle full of someone else's regrets. Your job as a knight: stand there and look menacing. Maybe help oversee the building of a siege tower, which is less engineering marvel, and more shaky wooden box held together with curses and damp rope. You direct some peasants to haul logs, try not to yell too much when the wheel falls off again, and spend the rest of the day trying to scrape mud off your greaves with a stick. It doesn't work. Nothing works. The mud wins. Let's talk about that mud. It's everywhere. It's in your boots, your tent, your soup. It climbs up your legs and settles into your bones. Your feet feel like they've been soaked in vinegar. You've changed your socks twice, only to discover the second pair was somehow wetter than the first. And you're not even at the worst part yet. The stench of camp settles into your nostrils like a squatter that refuses to leave. You've got thousands of men, hundreds of horses, and exactly one latrine trench. It overflows after the first rainstorm. The cooks do their best, but everything tastes like salted leather and regret. The stew is thin, the bread is hard enough to deflect arrows, and you're 85% sure the meat in last night's dinner was not from any creature you can name. You'd think siege warfare would at least involve some fighting. Not really. Mostly it's a staring contest. You sit outside the walls, they sit inside the walls, and you both hope the other side gets bored first. Sometimes you send out an insult-laden letter, and they respond by catapulting dead animals into your camp. Cow carcasses, barrels of refuse, even the occasional flaming pig. Yes, flaming pig. It's not just a wild party theme, it's psychological warfare, and it works. Here's a grim historical fact. Siege warfare often lasted for months. Not days, not weeks, months. There were sieges that dragged on for years, Entire seasons pass. You celebrate holidays from a muddy field, listening to the distant sound of someone vomiting into a helmet. Your armour starts to rust. Your beard gets out of control. You forget what dry feels like. By the time you finally breach the walls, if you breach them, you're not a gallant knight anymore. You're a mouldy rage goblin with a sword and a dream. Now for something a little offbeat. During some longer sieges, knights would organise tournaments inside the camp just to stay sharp, or stay sane. Makeshift lists were set up, complete with banners, mock charges, and confused squires running in circles. You're half-starved, poorly bathed, and possibly covered in lice. But by God, you're going to tilt at someone for sport, even if the prize is just a damp loaf of bread and not dying of boredom. There's an academic debate about how strategic these sieges actually were. Some historians argue that they were precise military operations with carefully calculated supply lines and engineering. Others point out that many devolved into chaotic messes, with disease and desertion doing more damage than swords ever did. Either way, you're stuck in the middle of one, and it feels less like a military manoeuvre, and more like a particularly violent camping trip where no one brought enough soap. And speaking of disease, let's talk about that. Siege camps are breeding grounds for illness. You've got open wounds, rotting food, shared drinking cups, and rats the size of cats. People start coughing, and soon you're stepping over corpses that didn't come from combat. Dysentery rips through the ranks like wildfire. One day, your bunkmate's complaining about the stew. The next, he's grey, cold, and still clutching his spoon. You do your best to stay alive. You avoid the common pot, stick to boiled water, and pray that your armour isn't harbouring its own ecosystem. But you're not optimistic. No one is. The joke in camp is that the walls won't kill you, the food will. You laugh, but quietly, because your stomach's been cramping for 2 days and you're starting to wonder if the meat really was rat. Then after weeks of this slow rot, you finally get the call. It's time to assault the walls. The siege towers are ready, shaky, creaky, and full of terrified foot soldiers. You climb into one, heart-pounding, mud clinging to your boots, hands slick with sweat inside your gauntlets. The air reeks of burning oil and fear. You're handed a shield that might stop one arrow. You say a quick prayer, mostly out of habit, and then the tower starts to roll forward. Arrows rain down. Someone screams, someone else slips and is immediately crushed by a wheel. You hold on to the sides, trying not to vomit. When the tower reaches the wall, a drawbridge slams down, and suddenly you're in the thick of it, men scrambling, slipping, swinging. You lunge forward, blade raised, and hope you're aiming at the enemy and not another exhausted knight who just wants to go home. The fighting is fast, brutal, and confusing. You take a blow to the helmet that leaves your ears ringing. You stab someone in the leg, you slip in blood and crack your elbow on the stone. By the time it's over, you're panting, bruised, and smeared with fluids you don't want to identify. But you're alive, and the castle is taken. There's no fanfare, no feast, just the slow realization that you'll have to do this again, somewhere else. Another muddy field, another wall, another stretch of boring, miserable, disease-ridden, soul-eroding siege. You ride back to camp in silence, your horse limping slightly, your armour dented, your body aching. You'd kill for a bath, or a fresh loaf of bread. Or a single day without mud, but you're a knight. This is what you do. There's a moment somewhere after your 5th siege and your 3rd bout of intestinal distress when someone inevitably brings up chivalry. And not in the sarcastic way you and your fellow knights mutter it, when someone accidentally drops a roast goose and 15 half-starved men dive for it. No, this is the ideal of chivalry, the noble code, the romanticised blueprint for knightly conduct, the thing the troubadours keep singing about when they're not busy rhyming honour with donor for the 20th time. You've heard it all your life. Chivalry. Courage in battle. Loyalty to your lord, courtesy to women, mercy to the weak. You were taught it as a page, recited it as a squire, and now you're expected to live it. But here's the problem. Reality is not a ballad. And on the battlefield, chivalry tends to disappear faster than a coin in a gambling tent. The chaos of combat doesn't leave room for noble declarations. When arrows are flying and someone's trying to jab a pike through your ribs, you're not pausing to ask their rank or whether they've yielded. You're swinging first, asking questions never, and hoping to make it out with all your limbs. Mercy is a nice idea, until you remember that the last guy you spared came back around later and tried to brain your squire with a rock. And even off the battlefield, the code gets blurry fast. You're supposed to respect the church, but your last campaign involved torching a monastery that was allegedly harbouring enemies, and definitely had excellent wine. You are meant to defend the poor, but also enforce taxes on them until they're one bad harvest away from starvation. You're told to honour ladies, but marriages are arranged, affairs are political currency, and the only love stories around here are the ones being copied out by monks who haven't spoken to a woman since they took their vows. Here's a hard historical fact. The chivalric code wasn't a legal system. It was more of a PR campaign, a vague, shifting set of ideals written mostly after the fact to make knights seem more noble than they usually were. Many of the most famous chivalric texts, like those by Chrétien de Troyes or Geoffrey of Monmouth, were literary inventions, not military manuals. Real knights read those stories the same way modern people read superhero comics, for entertainment, not instruction. Quirky bonus fact, some knights took chivalry very literally and tried to outdo each other with increasingly absurd acts of virtue. There's a recorded case of a knight swearing not to speak to a woman until he'd won 3 tournaments, and another who wore a lady's undergarment on his helmet for a month to prove his devotion. Sounds sweet, until you realise the woman in question didn't ask for any of this and mostly just wanted to eat her dinner in peace. And here's where the scholarly debate gets loud. Was chivalry a real force shaping medieval behaviour, or just a fantasy used to keep violent men in check? Some historians argue that it offered a genuine moral compass, particularly during the Crusades or when knights served as protectors of towns and pilgrims. Others say it was an empty shell, a convenient excuse to act brutally while quoting poetry. Both are probably true, depending on which knight you ask and whether he's currently winning or losing. In day-to-day life, chivalry mostly shows up in small performative gestures. You bow to your lord with exactly the right angle of humility. You stand when a noblewoman enters the room, even if your legs are screaming from yesterday's patrol. You offer polite words to peasants before you confiscate their grain in the name of royal necessity. And you attend courtly gatherings where you're expected to be graceful, poetic and clean, which frankly is more exhausting than any battle. Sometimes you're called upon to settle disputes, not by reasoning but by fighting. Judicial duels, they're called. 2 men with a grievance meet in a ring, swords in hand, and the knightly code says that divine will shall favour the righteous. Which sounds fine until you realise divine will looks a lot like who ate more yesterday, or who slipped on the blood first. You might be asked to serve as a second, or worse, a witness. Either way, you're standing in the mud watching 2 guys slowly batter each other into unconsciousness while the local priest blesses the ground they're currently bleeding on. You start to see through the cracks. You hear stories of knights pillaging villages after swearing to protect them, or ransoming nobles while burning their homes. You know, men who smile during sermons and commit atrocities by sundown. And yet, they call themselves chivalrous. They quote the code Toast to Honour, and ride off into battle waving banners that look more impressive than anything they've actually done. Still, you try. You hold the door for an elderly merchant. You stop your squire from kicking a beggar. You leave a coin at a roadside shrine and hope that somehow it balances out the fact that you once punched a guy in the face for stealing your wine cup. You don't know if it counts. You're not sure it ever did. In the end, chivalry feels less like a code and more like a costume. One you wear at the right times, in the right places, for the right people. You put it on when you ride into town, when you address the court, when you're in earshot of someone writing a poem. But underneath, you're just tired, dirty, bruised, and still trying to figure out if any of this ever meant anything. Back at camp, the bard strums a lute and sings of brave knights and noble deeds. Everyone listens, smiles, maybe even sighs wistfully. You sit by the fire, spooning lukewarm stew into your mouth, armour dented, conscience dented more, and wonder if the bard would still sing if he saw the real story. The cracked fingernails, the blood that never comes out, the kid you had to kill because he didn't drop his weapon fast enough, the way your squire flinches every time you raise your voice. Maybe chivalry was never meant for people like you. Maybe it's just a bedtime story for those who never had to wear a blade. You've made it this far, survived the mud, the plague-adjacent camp stews, the endless drills, and the crushing weight of armour pressing against your unmentionables every time you try to sit down. So naturally, the next brilliant idea someone has is, let's launch each other off horses for sport. Welcome to Jousting, the medieval pastime that somehow combines concussion, ego, and public humiliation into one high-speed disaster in shining armour. You don't get a choice, you're a knight now, which means you're expected to participate. Not because it's strategic or even useful, but because nobles get bored. And nothing cures a case of feudal ennui like watching two overconfident men try to murder each other with pointy sticks while a crowd cheers for blood. The arena is set up in the middle of a field lined with colourful tents and fluttering banners. It looks festive from a distance. Up close, it smells like sweaty horses, dust and anxiety. A wooden barrier called the tilt separates the two lanes. You're to gallop down one side while your opponent barrels toward you from the other, each of you holding a 12-foot lance made of ash wood and poor life choices. You climb into your tournament armour, heavier than battle gear but more decorative. It's designed to make you look noble and formidable like a walking pewter statue. Problem is, it severely restricts your movement. You can barely turn your head. Breathing is a challenge. You feel like a sausage that was armoured and then left in the sun. Now comes the lance. It's longer than your entire body and only slightly more cooperative than your warhorse, which, by the way, is not thrilled about being dressed in caparison. That's a fancy word for tapestry that makes the horse want to bite someone. You steady the lance under your arm, trying to remember everything the tournament master barked at you earlier. Lean forward, aim for the shield, keep your seat, don't die. The trumpet blares, the crowd roars. You dig your heels in and your destrier lunges forward, snorting steam like a dragon with a head cold. The world narrows to a single target, the knight thundering toward you, also looking way too determined for comfort. You aim your lance, brace for impact, and then, crack! The lance explodes into splinters. Your ears ring, your arm goes numb. You stay on your horse barely, but your opponent does not. He flips sideways, arms flailing, and lands in a heap of shiny limbs on the ground while the crowd erupts in cheers, groans, and drunken bets being settled with fists. Someone declares you the winner. You nod politely. Even though your vision is blurry and you're pretty sure one of your ribs has rotated to a new zip code. You smile for the audience, dismount stiffly, and limp back to your tent where your squire is waiting with wine and a look that says, "Why do you keep doing this?" Good question. Here's a historical fact for your consideration. Jousting wasn't originally a sport. It started as a practical form of military training, practice for cavalry charges and lance techniques. Over time, it evolved into tournament spectacle, complete with pageantry, judges, and prizes. By the late medieval period, it was less about preparing for war, and more about performing for aristocrats who didn't have to clean their own wounds afterward. Fringe fact for flavour. Some knights took jousting very seriously, like in building a special shrine for their lance serious. There were even records of knights hiring poets to write about their victories, commissioning expensive armour specifically for show, and refusing to compete against anyone who couldn't trace their noble lineage back at least 6 generations, because nothing says honour like elitist gatekeeping and artistic self-promotion. Now for the academic argument. Scholars debate whether jousting helped or hurt knighthood. Some say it reinforced ideals of bravery, discipline, and martial excellence. Others argue it turned knights into pageant performers, less warriors, more reality show contestants with better costumes. Was it the pinnacle of noble skill or a distraction from actual war? Depends who's funding the tournament. Back in your tent you nurse your bruises, your shoulder throbs from the lance impact, your wrist is swelling, and you've discovered a fresh dent in your breastplate in the shape of someone else's family crest. You pop it out with a mallet, and try to ignore the twitch in your left eye that started halfway through the last charge, and hasn't stopped since. And it doesn't stop there. After the joust comes the melee, a team-based free-for-all where knights beat the stuffing out of each other with blunted weapons. It's supposed to be safer than war. It's not. You charge in with a mace swinging at anything that isn't wearing your colours, and within seconds you've been clubbed on the thigh, elbowed in the face, and accidentally tackled by a guy who thought you were someone else. You crawl out half an hour later covered in dirt, blood, and the shattered remains of your pride. Still, there's something addictive about it. The noise, the rush, the moment when the crowd chants your name, and for once you're not just another smelly knight with debt and rashes. You're a champion. A figure of admiration. Even if only for 5 minutes before someone vomits in the sidelines and a noble's lapdog pees on your boot. You leave the field exhausted, every joint singing the medieval blues, and try to avoid the drunk guy demanding a rematch because his lance was defective. Your squire hands you a cup of wine, and you sip it slowly, watching the sun dip low behind the tents. The day is ending, you're sore, bruised, slightly concussed, and deeply aware that you'll be limping for at least a week. But hey, At least today you weren't crawling through a siege trench full of flaming pigs. Small victories. It's easy to think that feasts are where the real perks of being a knight kick in. After all, you've survived battles, trained until your joints creak like ship ropes, and gotten flung off horses in front of judgmental crowds. Surely now you can sit back, tuck into a glistening roast, raise a golden goblet, and finally live like the nobles in the stories. But here's the reality. Medieval feasting is more punishment than reward. It's overcooked, undercooked, poorly stored, disease-adjacent, and usually ends with at least one knight slumped in the corner, cradling his stomach like it betrayed him in a duel. You enter the hall in full gear, or the scratchy woolen equivalent if you're not trying to impress, and immediately you're hit with the smell. Roasted meat, spices, tallow candles, unwashed bodies, wet dogs, and something vaguely fishy that no one can identify but everyone pretends not to smell. You shuffle to your assigned place at the long trestle tables, trying to avoid sitting next to the guy who once ate an entire eel and then tried to sword fight the fireplace. Feasts are social minefields. You're expected to be charming, well-mannered, and ready to leap into praise whenever your lord's mediocre hunting story begins again. You nod along, chuckle politely, and stuff your mouth with bread whenever someone tries to start a conversation about local politics. You also keep your eyes on the cupbearer, because your goblet seems to refill itself every 5 minutes, and you're beginning to suspect that no one has any concept of moderation. Let's talk about the food. At first glance, it's impressive. Platters piled high with roasted birds, glazed boar heads, and strange congealed dishes that jiggle ominously when served. Everything is spiced heavily, mostly to cover up the fact that it's not entirely fresh. If it smells odd, just add more cinnamon. If it looks off-colour, just smother it in sauce and give it a French name. You reach for a leg of something, probably venison, possibly horse, and begin gnawing like a starving wolf. No forks, of course. Those are considered foreign and vaguely sinful in some circles. You eat with your fingers, tearing chunks from the bone, and wiping your hands on the communal tablecloth, which is more decorative than effective. Your teeth ache from chewing. You find a gristle bit, spit it discreetly into your palm and flick it under the table where the dogs are already circling like little hairy hyenas. Then comes the pottage. It's a gamble. Sometimes it's rich and hearty, made with fresh vegetables and barley. Other times it's grey, lumpy and suspiciously crunchy in parts, where nothing should be crunchy. You chew slowly, hoping it's oats and not bugs. The kitchen staff is overworked, underpaid, and mostly blind from smoke inhalation, so mistakes happen. Last week someone found a feather in their stew, a whole one. Here's a historical fact that may sour your appetite even more. Medieval kitchens didn't have consistent heat or regulated storage. Most food sat in wooden or stone pantries, susceptible to mould, insects, and enthusiastic rodents. Meat was often preserved in salt or vinegar, but preserved just meant hopefully not completely rancid. So if your dinner tasted weird, that might not be your imagination. It might be botulism. You keep eating anyway. Why? Because you're starving. Training burns calories like wildfire, and battlefield rations are usually just dry biscuits and regret. So when someone sets down a second platter of glazed duck, possibly goose, maybe cat, you go for it, etiquette be damned. And then comes the wine. Oh, the wine. Sweet, thick, and served from massive pitchers, it flows like water. Probably because the actual water is undrinkable. You're encouraged to drink and drink deeply. Toasts are made, songs are sung. You're expected to keep up, even though mixing meat, questionable stews, and gallons of wine is a gastrointestinal suicide pact. Someone passes you a slice of meat pie that smells like old socks and regret. You nod politely, take a bite, and try not to gag. It's spicy in a way that implies it's covering up something far worse. You chase it with more wine, because that's the only thing masking the fact that your stomach is already sending warning signals. Here's a fringe fact. The combination of rich food, minimal hygiene, and excessive alcohol led to a condition charmingly known as knight's gout. A fiery, stabbing pain in the joints, especially the feet. You hear whispers about it often. Sir Baldwin can't wear his boots anymore. Sir Corwin limps like a pirate. You laugh nervously, then glance down at your swollen ankle and start to wonder. Now, in the background, the entertainment ramps up. A minstrel sings about your lord's most recent glorious victory, which was actually a skirmish against a group of malnourished bandits armed with sticks. There are jugglers, fire-eaters, and one guy trying to balance a duck on his head while reciting Latin poetry. It's hard to tell if this is supposed to be impressive or just a bet gone wrong. Meanwhile, the knights around you are getting progressively louder. One starts telling a story about a tournament he totally won last year, despite everyone remembering him falling off his horse before the first pass. Another brags about a lady in waiting who totally winked at him across the hall. A third just starts laughing uncontrollably and then falls asleep face down in a bowl of pudding. Suddenly someone slams a mug down and challenges another knight to a drinking contest. A chant begins. Fists pound the table. You try to back away, but someone grabs your shoulder and insists you drink next. You down the cup. Then another. Then a third. The room tilts. You smile vaguely and realise you've forgotten your own name. Later, you stumble out into the courtyard, clutching your stomach like it's trying to crawl out of your body. The night air is cold, the stars blur. You lean against a wall and breathe through your mouth, praying you don't vomit in front of anyone important. It's only after you recover that you notice someone else is already passed out in a hedge, snoring loudly, their armour half unbuckled and one boot missing. And still, the feast continues inside. You consider going back for dessert, until you remember what happened the last time you tried the custard and nearly went blind from whatever they put in it. Eventually, you drag yourself to your bedroll, stomach churning, brain foggy, mouth dry. You lie awake listening to distant laughter and the sound of someone retching behind the stables. You dream of plain bread and clean water. Feasts. It turns out, are just another kind of battle. Morning comes with the subtle grace of a cathedral bell slammed directly against your skull. Your head is pounding, your mouth feels like someone filled it with parchment, and your stomach is locked in a tense negotiation with gravity. You sit up slowly, armour clanking somewhere nearby where you tossed it in a drunken haze, and try to remember what you said last night. Or to whom? Probably something stupid. Hopefully not to anyone with influence or a sword longer than yours. This, apparently, is the glorious life of a knight. But don't worry, if you're feeling uncertain about your purpose, someone will soon bring up the chivalric virtues again. Those ever-present, ever-vague ideals that haunt your profession like a passive-aggressive ghost. It's a lot of words, really. Honour, valour, courtesy, humility, justice, loyalty, you're supposed to embody all of them, all the time, while wielding a sword, riding a murderous horse and making sure your tunic doesn't smell like expired cheese. So what is chivalry, really? We already talked about it as a PR campaign, sure, but now let's dig into its finer, shinier threads. Because you're expected not just to fight bravely and serve loyally, you're supposed to act like a holy warrior, a moral beacon, a man so noble he makes priests look suspiciously human. No pressure. You're supposed to defend the church, uphold the law, protect the innocent, respect women, noble ones, that is, common women. The code gets weirdly quiet on that part. You're expected to love chastely, pray regularly, fast on the right day, and be generous even when your coin pouch is emptier than your soul after a siege. And none of this is optional. These aren't suggestions. This is the blueprint for your entire life. Deviate too much, and people talk. Rumours start. You might get overlooked for that sweet little land grant you've been angling for. You might get passed over when it's time to pick a champion for the local tournament. Worse still, your name might not make it into the court bard's next tale, and that's social death. You do your best, you try to be kind to the servants, nod politely when peasants bow too low, and give a handful of pennies to a crippled beggar you suspect might be faking it. You even resist the urge to punch that smug young knight from the south who keeps bragging about his new banner design and the unmatched purity of his soul. But then there's the other side of chivalry, the part people whisper about in corners, because despite all the talk of honour and humility, you know exactly how much image matters. The right gestures in the right rooms are worth more than a decade of actual virtue. You can be a selfish, cruel, drunken lout as long as you clean up nice and quote a psalm or two when the bishop is in earshot. Here's a historical reality check. Much of the so-called Code of Chivalry was written after the age of real, brutal warfare crafted by poets, priests and chroniclers with a stake in making knights look better than they were, the Book of the Order of Chivalry by Ramon Lull, or the Song of Roland. They laid out the ideals, not the practice. The practice was muddier, bloodier, louder. Fringe fact incoming. Some knights formed literal, chivalric brotherhoods, with flowery names like the Order of the Star or the Order of the Dragon. These were part religious devotion, part fraternity, and part elaborate PR. Some had rules so strict that leaving battle dishonourably meant automatic expulsion. Of course, half of them disbanded within a few years because knights, surprise, didn't like following rules when they got inconvenient. And here's the juicy scholarly debate. Did chivalry ever really function as a code of conduct, or was it just window dressing for political control? Some argue it was a powerful behavioural system that prevented chaos. Others say it was a leash, one wrapped in gold and silk but still meant to keep dangerous men predictable. A sword is easier to trust when it's pretending to be a saint. Your personal experience? Chivalry is exhausting, it's performance art with chainmail. One day you're praised for rescuing a noblewoman's handkerchief from a fountain. The next, you're scolded for not kneeling low enough when her older cousin walked past in court. It's a never-ending test of posture, tone, facial expression, and knowing the exact right moment to quote Virgil without sounding smug. And women? Oh, that's an entirely separate scroll of contradictions. You're expected to serve them, revere them, fight duels for their honour, write poetry about their eyes and their tresses, and how their love is the light that guides your blade. But don't touch them, unless you're married, or unless she's lower class, or unless it's politically advantageous, or unless nobody's looking. It's a delicate dance. And one wrong step can end with a dagger between your ribs, or a wedding you absolutely didn't want. Then there's the courtly love game. You're supposed to pine, to long, to sigh, write songs, send flowers, die tragically of heartbreak if possible. The reality? Half the ladies in court are married to men twice their age and bored out of their minds, and the other half are playing this game better than any knight ever could. You spend 2 weeks writing a painfully awkward ballad, and she laughs at your rhymes and gives the flower to her hunting dog. You begin to realise that chivalry isn't a code, it's a cage, not the worst one, but a subtle one. It demands your public perfection, your private restraint, and your unwavering obedience to a system that only occasionally returns the favour. You're held to impossible standards by people who have no intention of living up to them themselves. Still, you keep trying. You pull out your best cloak, you bow with perfect form, you let the local priest win at chess, you donate to the poor box even though you know the steward skims half of it. You walk the line, careful and practiced, because the moment you step off it, you risk becoming something worse than dishonourable. You risk becoming forgettable. And as you kneel beside the hearth that night, whispering a rote prayer to whatever saint is supposed to watch over knights with worn-out boots and blood-stained conscience, you wonder quietly if any of it has ever really mattered. Or if the only true knightly virtue is learning how to survive the performance. It always starts the same way. A cough, a sniffle, someone muttering about bad air or a sickness going around. You ignore it. You've got bigger problems. Your sword's chipped, your horse threw a shoe, and your latest assignment involved guarding a noble who insisted on travelling with 17 trunks of perfume and no map. But the coughs get louder, the sniffles turn into fevers, people stop coming to meals. Then someone says the word you've been hoping not to hear your entire adult life. Plague. The Black Death doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It seeps in, slowly, quietly. One man leaves the barracks to lie down. He never gets up. Another collapses during weapons training, bleeding from his nose, shaking, skin already going dark at the edges. No one's sure how it spreads. Theories fly, bad water, foul winds, angry saints, rats, which, to be fair, are everywhere. You've always thought your armour made you invincible. Turns out it can't stop a flea. Your camp changes overnight. No more drills, no more training. The tournaments are cancelled, the court emptied, the noble you were supposed to guard has already fled with his perfume into the hills. Half the servants disappear. The other half won't touch anything unless it's been boiled, blessed, or set on fire first. You try to stay calm. You tell yourself you're strong, young, and not afraid of illness, but the guy in the next cot was also strong. Now he's a pile of blankets that no one wants to move. The thing about plague is, it doesn't care about class. Knights die, squires die. Lords, ladies, monks, merchants, gone. The village nearby, the one that fed you during patrol, empty. Smoke still rises from the chimney of the baker's hut. But there's no one left inside. You saw the family 3 days ago. Now the doors are barred and a crude X is painted in ash above the threshold. You're told to keep away from the sick. Helpful, really. Because it's not like you are already bathing once a month and sleeping in a crowded tent next to 3 other men who snore directly into your lungs. Every breath feels like a gamble. You keep your helmet off now, not because you're relaxing, but because you don't want to be buried in it. Not like Sir Osric, whose corpse was dragged out of camp still wearing his visor. No one wanted to touch his face. Let's be clear, nothing about plague feels medieval. It feels apocalyptic. Horses panic when they smell dust or death. Flies hover in dense clouds, and priests walk from camp to camp swinging incense and murmuring prayers while trying not to faint from the heat. You see more crosses raised in a week than you've seen in a year. One of the friars tells you this is a punishment from God. You nod, not because you agree, but because it's easier than arguing while watching someone cough blood onto their own boots. Here's a brutal historical truth. The Black Death wiped out as much as a third of Europe's population in just a few years. Entire towns were erased. In some regions, so many people died that the crops rotted in the fields because no one was left to harvest them. You were trained to face death by blade and arrow, not death by breath, death by shit, and death that creeps insolently and leaves nothing behind but quiet. And here's a quirky, slightly insane fringe fact. Some knights, desperate to survive, would carry charms, amulets, or even live frogs in pouches strapped to their belts, believing they could ward off illness. You know a guy who stuck a dried bat to the inside of his helmet, said it was sacred. He died 2 days later. The bat smelled like boiled leather for a week. Scholars argue to this day about what people truly believed in the face of plague. Some say faith deepened. Others argue the sheer randomness of who lived and who died shattered belief entirely. You're not sure what you believe anymore. You stop lighting candles in the chapel after the third priest keeled over mid-mass. But sometimes, when the camp is quiet, you find yourself whispering prayers you haven't said since childhood, just in case the logistics of plague are their own nightmare. Who buries the dead? Oh, no one wants to. Graves are shallow. Sometimes they're not even dug. Just a tarp pulled over the body and a few rocks to keep the wolves away. The smell is indescribable. Sweet, sharp and wrong. It lingers in your nose long after you've left the site. You start sleeping with your scarf tied around your face, which does nothing, but makes you feel slightly less exposed to the invisible doom floating in the air. Your daily life shifts into a survival routine. Wash everything in vinegar. Your hands, your armour, your horse's saddle. Avoid touching anything. Don't share cups. Avoid crowds even when the sergeant calls a meeting. That's how Sir Giles went. 1 bad cough in the war tent, and 5 of you were coughing by dawn. Only 2 got better. You were 1, you don't know why. Eventually the worst passes. The fever burns through the camp like wildfire, and then, as quickly as it came, it fades. The dead are buried or burned. The chapel is reopened. The stew returns to tasting like boiled disappointment instead of ash. Someone makes a joke, a bad one, but you laugh. Too hard. Because it's the first time in weeks you've heard a sound that wasn't crying or coughing, or a bell tolling slowly in the wind. You're not the same. None of you are. You've lost comrades, friends, and your last few strands of optimism. You stare at your reflection in a dented breastplate and barely recognise the gaunt, sunken-eyed man looking back. You went into battle expecting to die by sword. Instead, you lived through something you couldn't even see, and now it's time to go back to normals, patrol the roads, attend court. Put on your polished armour and pretend you're the same knight who left last month. But deep down you know the truth. You survived the plague, but part of you didn't. After the plague, everything's quieter. Not in the peaceful, birds chirping, blessed silence kind of way, but in the hollow, something is missing, everyone's seen too much sort of way. People walk slower, conversations stop when someone sneezes. The laughter that once bounced off the stone walls of the Great Hall now sounds thin, like it's trying too hard. You're not sure what's worse, the sickness itself or the strange half-life that follows. But either way, you're back to being a knight, which means it's time to start worrying about your soul again. Because while plague might not have cared who it hit, the church sure does. You were always told that knighthood and faith go hand in hand, that you serve your lord, your king, and your god with equal fear and devotion. Except now, after watching half your camp die while clutching rosaries that did absolutely nothing, you're beginning to ask yourself questions you never dared speak out loud. But doubting doesn't stop the rituals. In fact, it makes them louder. Every knight you know starts attending mass a little more urgently. You all kneel harder, cross yourselves with more flair, recite psalms like you're trying to outpray each other. You fast on holy days, well, you try. The kitchen still serves meat, and no one has the energy to argue with the cook, who has replaced faith with onions and bitterness. But you do the best you can, because that's what's expected. Confession becomes your new battlefield. You kneel before the local priest, a thin man who smells like candle wax and judgment, and unload your sins like a drunk dropping armour. Violence, lust, pride, there's always something. You never come out clean, just temporarily aired out, like scrubbing a stain that won't quite leave the fabric. You confess things you're not sorry for and forget things you should be sorry for. He absolves you, and you walk away, lighter and still guilty. The church has answers for everything, of course. Why do people die in droves? Because sin. Why are children taken and bandits spared? God's plan. Why are you, a knight trained for battle, constantly being asked to donate to cathedral renovations? Divine obligation. And if you question any of this too loudly, congratulations, you're now suspect. Maybe not a heretic, but definitely a bad influence. There's a fine line between doubt and damnation, and you're starting to notice your boots scuffing dangerously close to it. Here's your historical reality check. Religion in medieval Europe isn't a gentle backdrop, it's the operating system. The church doesn't just influence your life, it owns it. Your birth, your oaths, your land, your marriage, your funeral, it all passes through the hands of priests, bishops, and abbots, with well-fed robes and suspiciously shiny rings. You fight for your king, but your soul? That belongs to the church. And it's not just about attending mass and mumbling Latin. Knights are supposed to be spiritual warriors. You're expected to carry relics into battle, wear crosses on your surcoat and see every fight as part of a divine struggle between good and evil. But when your enemies also wear crosses and shout the same prayers in your face while trying to disembowel you, it's hard not to feel like maybe God's playing both sides. Quirky fact for flavour, many knights had their swords blessed by priests before battle. Not metaphorically, literally. Sprinkled with holy water, waved over with prayers, sometimes even anointed with oil. The idea was that your blade, like you, served a higher cause. Of course, after the battle, that same sword would be covered in blood nicked from hitting bone and used to carve roast goose by the campfire. Holiness apparently is washable. And here's the scholarly debate. Was medieval knighthood truly entwined with religion, or was it just convenient branding? Some argue that knights were sincere, spending time in monasteries between battles, going on pilgrimages, fasting for weeks to purify themselves. Others suggest it was performative, a way to justify conquest, colonization, and violent land grabs by slapping a cross on your banner and calling it righteousness. The truth probably lives somewhere in the middle, curled up like a tired friar in the back pew of history. You've done your part. You've escorted priests through bandit-ridden woods, carried holy relics into battle, and donated a frankly ridiculous amount of coin to rebuild a chapel that mysteriously burned down after a feast involving too many torches and one ambitious fire juggler. You've knelt in stone chapels, your knees aching, whispering prayers to saints whose names you barely remember. And still you wonder, do your prayers matter more than your sword? Does the blood on your hands cancel out the bread you just received at communion? There's this constant tension between your role as a warrior and your supposed identity as a man of faith. One minute you're slicing through raiders with practiced efficiency. The next, you're being told to show mercy, to forgive, to turn the other cheek. You try, really. But sometimes mercy gets you killed, and forgiveness doesn't undo the stabbing. Even among your peers, there's no consensus. Some take it seriously, chanting prayers before meals, observing every fast, refusing to draw steel on Sundays. Others treat religion like armour polish. Something you apply before inspection, but ignore the rest of the week. You fall somewhere in the middle, sincere enough not to mock it. Cynical enough to know that the loudest pious men are usually the ones hiding something. Your most vivid religious moment comes one cold morning on patrol. You find a roadside shrine, half collapsed, overgrown with ivy. No one's there, no priest, no ceremony. Just an old stone figure of St. Michael, sword raised, wings chipped. You dismount, kneel, and light a tiny candle you've been carrying for months. You don't pray for victory or forgiveness, just a little less pain, maybe a dream that doesn't end in screaming. Then you ride on, saying nothing. At night, when the camp is quiet and the stars are out, you sometimes wonder what the afterlife looks like for men like you. Do knights go to heaven, or is there a separate hall for those who killed nobly, doubted privately, and served faithfully even when they no longer believed? You don't know, no one does, but you still kneel before battle. Still murmur the words, not because you believe they'll save you, but because if they don't, what else is left? You don't know how it started, just that one day a dusty herald rode into the courtyard with a scroll longer than your arm, sweating through his doublet and squinting like someone who's seen too much sun and not enough common sense. He unrolled the parchment, read a proclamation in booming Latin, and suddenly everyone was talking about glory, about salvation, about a holy war in a land you've only heard about in sermons and tavern tales. Welcome to the Crusades, or as you like to call them, sand, suffering, and the world's most disorganised vacation package. You're told it's a sacred duty, a divine calling. You'll journey to Jerusalem and liberate the Holy Land from infidels, win eternal grace and possibly a few acres of land if things go well. You barely finish your stew that evening before your lord is calling his banners, rounding up knights and giving you 2 days to pack, 2 days to prepare for a journey across continents. You would have more time to get ready for a feast. So you gather what you can, your armour, of course your sword sharpened and recently blessed, a few spare tunics, your best surcoat, your most tolerable boots, and a thin leather-bound prayer book you haven't opened since Lent. You pawn your remaining cup set for extra coin. You kiss your horse on the nose, promise to return, and immediately regret getting sentimental over an animal that once kicked you into a dung heap. Then the march begins. You and your fellow knights cross country after country, city after city, with no real idea where you're going beyond east. Every town you pass looks at you with a mix of curiosity and concern. Some cheer, most just lock their doors and hope the Crusaders keep moving. The roads are long, hot, and surprisingly uneventful, until they're suddenly very eventful. Bridges collapse, supplies run low. One guy drinks from a suspicious puddle and spends the next 2 days vomiting into his helmet. By the time you reach the coast, you've lost 5 men to illness, 1 to a bar fight, and 2 to a priest who decided that taking the cross didn't mean following orders. And that's before the sea voyage. A word of advice: if you've never been on a ship before, don't start now. Especially not one packed with men who haven't bathed since the last rainfall and think throwing up over the side is a bonding ritual. Eventually, after weeks of salt air, spoiled biscuits, and waves that make your joints ache, you arrive. Not at Jerusalem, no, don't be silly. You arrive in some miserable port city on the Mediterranean where the sun is trying to murder you and everyone speaks a language you don't understand. Your armour, which once gleamed nobly, now smells like dead fish and has taken on the colour of despair. Your skin burns. Your lips crack. You sweat in places you didn't even know could sweat. And then there's the sand. It's everywhere. In your boots, your gloves, your beard. In your soul, you try to wipe it off and somehow end up with more. You wake up chewing it. You dream about drowning in dunes. And sand becomes the defining feature of your personality. People stop asking how you're doing. They just ask how much sand you've eaten today. But you press on. That's what knights do, right? The heat blurs your vision. You drink water that tastes like it was filtered through a goat. You march, sweat, curse, and wonder how a holy mission manages to feel exactly like being punished for a sin you don't remember committing. Here's a historical gut punch. Many Crusaders never even saw the Holy Land. They died in transit, in minor skirmishes, or of disease long before reaching Jerusalem. And the ones who did make it? They often found cities already taken, retaken, or currently being disputed by other Crusaders. Welcome to the world's most chaotic game of territorial tug-of-war. Quirky detail. Crusaders used to sew little red crosses onto their garments to show their devotion. By the time you've crossed 2 borders and 3 deserts, yours is faded to pink, covered in blood, and held on with stitches from your own squire's sewing kit. It's less holy symbol now and more tragic fashion statement. There's also an ongoing scholarly debate, no surprise there, about the true motivations of knights who joined the Crusades. Was it genuine piety? A thirst for land and loot? Peer pressure? Redemption? Historians toss these questions around like hot coals, but here's what you know. You're here, you're tired, and someone promised you eternal salvation for marching east with a sword. At this point you'd settle for a bath and some decent bread. When you do encounter battle, it's nothing like you expected. Not clean lines or gallant charges, just chaos, screaming, blinding sun, blood that dries into your tunic before the fight's even over. Your armour feels like it's cooking you from the inside. You stumble through sand, tripping over corpses, some enemy, some friend, all equally dead. You fight because there's nothing else to do, no speeches, no hymns, just steel and cold dust and the raw hope that if you kill enough, maybe you'll live long enough to ask why you came here in the first place. Between battles, you help secure towns, which mostly involves looting, burning, and trying to explain to confused locals why a group of sunburned Europeans is breaking all their pottery in the name of Christ. You're told it's part of the cleansing. You're not so sure anymore. You meet knights from other kingdoms, some friendly, some not. Some speak languages you don't understand, but all of them look exactly like you. Tired, sunburned, slightly unhinged. You trade stories, share wine, stare out at the horizon, and wonder what home feels like now. You're not sure you remember. Eventually you're told the mission is complete, the city has been taken, or lost, or maybe a treaty was signed. It's hard to keep up. You pack up what little you have, some coins, a cracked shield, a necklace from a merchant who said it would ward off evil, it didn't, and begin the long journey home. Half your company is gone, your horse is a skeleton with hooves. You walk most of the way, and when you finally return, dusty, scarred, older than you should be, they call you a hero, they throw you a feast, they ask you to tell stories of the Holy Land, of the glorious campaign of divine victory. You smile politely, you nod. You tell them about the sun and the dust, and the sound a man makes when he dies with sand in his lungs. You don't mention the rest. They wouldn't understand. You've returned from the Crusades alive somehow, and minus only one finger, half your faith, and most of your sense of humour. Your reward? A drafty stone box your lord calls a home. That's right, your very own corner of a medieval castle. You dreamed of this once. A seat at the hearth, tapestries fluttering, the warm glow of candlelight reflecting off polished armour. What you get instead is bone-chilling cold, mice that pay no rent, and a suspicious drip from the ceiling that defies both architecture and physics. Castles, it turns out, are not cosy. They are stone fortresses built more for keeping people out than keeping residents comfortable. Your chamber, if you're lucky enough to have one, is a windowless nook with a straw mattress, a wash basin, and a single wooden chest that doubles as a chair, footrest, and occasionally shield. You're constantly cold, the walls weep moisture, your breath fogs indoors. At night you can hear the wind howling through cracks that weren't supposed to exist, rattling the shutters and sometimes your will to live. You sleep under furs and wool layers so heavy it feels like being buried politely. Still, the chill finds you. It creeps into your joints and settles like a long-term tenant. Your knees ache, your back stiffens. You wake up more exhausted than you went to bed. There's a fireplace in the hall, but it only heats the Lord's table, and if you sit too close, someone higher up the pecking order will accidentally knock over your stool. Bathrooms don't exist. You get a chamber pot. You empty it yourself unless you have a servant or a deeply unfortunate squire. Otherwise, your options are go in a pot, go outside and freeze off something valuable, or sneak down to the guardrobe, a stone chute overhanging the wall that sends your waste tumbling into the moat or the courtyard depending on the wind. There's no plumbing, just gravity and hope. That suspicious drip in the ceiling could be condensation, could be your upstairs neighbour's chamber pot leaking through a crack in the stone. There's a reason nobody stores anything valuable on the lower floors. Let's talk about the noise. You imagined castle life as quiet and regal. In reality, it's a constant clamour. There's the clatter of boots on stone, dogs barking, pigs squealing, chickens doing whatever chaos chickens do. Blacksmiths hammering, servants shouting, and at least one baby crying somewhere at all hours. Someone always burns something in the kitchen, and the smell of smoke mixes with wet wool, spoiled milk, and the general aroma of too many people in too little space. And then there's the rats. Oh yes, you'll find them in the walls, the floor, your food, and sometimes your boots. You once woke up to one sitting on your chest like it was your roommate. You locked eyes. It didn't blink. It won. Here's a historical reality check. Castles weren't designed for comfort. Their purpose was military, defensive, and frankly, impressive looking from a distance. Inside, cramped halls, spiral staircases designed to favour right-handed defenders, and arrow slits that let in more cold than actual arrows. Tapestries are there to trap warmth, not just to display your lord's extremely flattering depiction of himself slaying a dragon that suspiciously resembles his cousin. Quirky side note. Some nobles actually installed warming stones, blocks of stone heated in the fireplace and then rolled under the bed with tongs. Not exactly central heating, but better than waking up with your beard frozen to your pillow. Scholars love to debate how tolerable castle life really was. Some argue it wasn't that bad, especially for higher-ranking knights who had servants, thick cloaks, and fewer scruples about throwing their leftovers out a window. Others insist most of you lived like well-armed cave dwellers, constantly brushing mildew off your sleeves and pretending not to hear the scratching behind the tapestries. Daily life inside the walls is a repetitive grind of mealtimes, minor errands, and dodging responsibility. You help supervise patrols, you check the stores, you train endlessly in the courtyard, because apparently even after you've been to war, you still need to practice hitting things. You also spend an unhealthy amount of time just trying to stay dry, warm, and vaguely clean. You wash in a wooden tub when you can, which is rarely, because heating that much water requires a miracle or a kitchen staff that doesn't already hate you. The dining hall is the social centre, and it's a mess. You eat with dozens of others at long, greasy tables. The food is better than campaign rations, but not by much. Meat when it's available, stew that tastes like every stew before it, ale that's strong enough to strip paint. You're constantly interrupted by loud nobles, obnoxious dogs, and some poor minstrel trying to get applause by rhyming love with dove. For the 10th time this week. Privacy is non-existent. People walk in and out of your chamber freely. Gossip spreads faster than if you once sneezed during Vespers, and by evening the steward claimed you were dying. You now fake stomach aches just to get a moment alone in the chapel, which smells like incense and wet moss, but is blessedly quiet. Oh, and your armour. It lives in your chamber. There's no armoury space for low-priority knights. You oil it, polish it, stack it in the corner, and occasionally trip over it at night. It's like a metallic roommate who never cleans up and always wants attention. So no, castle life isn't the luxurious retirement you once imagined. It's survival, just indoors. Your biggest threats aren't swords or sieges, they're drafty halls, undercooked meat, and damp that slowly chews through your bones. Still, when the wind dies down and the fire crackles just right, you sometimes close your eyes and remember what it felt like to think this place was paradise. Then a rat runs across your foot and you remember. It's just home. It happens slowly at first, whispers in the taverns, a missing bailiff, a broken tool left like a message on the manor steps. You hear rumours that someone refused to pay their grain tax, that a pig was taken back from a lord's cart, then a steward's cart is overturned, then his face, then someone sets fire to a hayloft, and before anyone really says it aloud, you realise the peasants are no longer just grumbling. They're rising. It's peasant revolt season. Again, you'd think people who spend their lives ankle-deep in mud, bent over in a barley field, would be too tired to rebel. You'd think hunger would beat obedience into them. But starvation does strange things, so does taxation. So does watching their children waste away while nobles feast on roast goose and spill wine like water. And when enough of them have nothing left to lose, they finally decide they don't care how shiny your armour is, and you, lucky you, get to be the one standing between their rage and your lord's linen collection. It starts with a call to arms in the middle of the night. You're pulled out of bed, bleary-eyed and still half dreaming of clean socks. A messenger breathlessly informs you that several villages nearby have grown discontent. That's noble speak for they're sharpening pitchforks and screaming about justice. You're told to ride out with a few men, restore order, and, if necessary, make an example. You gear up reluctantly. This isn't a glorious battle. There's no enemy army waiting with banners raised. This is a field full of angry farmers, some carrying torches, most with improvised weapons, scythes, hammers, axes stolen from the blacksmith's shed. No tactics, no ranks, just desperation. And yet, they scare you more than any cavalry charge ever has. You arrive to find the village square already in chaos. Smoke drifts from the manor house. Someone's tied the steward to a post and is pelting him with turnips. You don't know if that's better or worse than the fire. The villagers turn when they see your armour. Some flinch, others spit. A few raise their weapons, and you realise with a cold weight in your gut that they aren't bluffing. Here's a hard historical fact. Peasant revolts weren't rare. They flared up across Europe throughout the medieval period, from the Jacquerie in France to the Peasants' Revolt in England. And they weren't just aimless rage. They had leaders, demands, sometimes even charters outlining exactly which laws needed to change. But knights weren't trained to read charters. They were trained to crush them. And that's exactly what you're expected to do. You try reason first, shouting that anyone who lays down their weapon will be spared. A few back off, most don't. You charge or you swing. You bring a sword designed for armoured warfare down on a man wearing nothing but a homespun tunic and the stubborn look of a father with too many mouths to feed. The sword doesn't hesitate, you do, just for a second, but it's enough to notice the blood. And the child watching from the edge of the crowd. You clear the square. It doesn't take long. Their tools aren't made for war. Their shields are just wagon doors and old barrels, but they fight like cornered animals. A woman throws a pot at your face. A boy stabs your leg with a garden fork. When it's over, the square is quiet again, except for the sound of fire, weeping, and the crunch of your boots over spilled grain. And here comes the fringe fact. In some revolts, peasants actually captured knights and held them for ransom, turning the feudal system on its head. Just for a while, they'd dress up in looted armour, imitate courtly manners, and mock the very structure that kept them at the bottom of the pile. A brief moment of revenge dressed as parody. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about the role of knights during these uprisings. Were they mindless enforcers of an unjust system, or were they simply cogs in a machine they didn't build, caught between their oaths and their own reluctant consciences? The truth doesn't flatter anyone. You didn't write the laws, you just follow them. You didn't raise taxes, you just collected them. But when someone screams that their baby died from cold and hunger, they're not looking for a law book. They're looking for someone to blame, and you're wearing a helmet with a crest. After the revolt is quelled, you're rewarded with silence, not praise, not coin, just swornness. The kind that makes your ears ring. You ride back to the castle with ash on your boots and a strange hollow ache where your pride used to be. Your lord thanks you with a nod and returns to counting coin. You go to the chapel, sit, don't pray, just You try to eat. The food tastes like dirt. You try to sleep. Your dreams are crowded with villagers' faces. Some scared, some angry, all burned into your memory like brands. You tell yourself you were keeping order, that they were dangerous, that they attacked first. And yet you can't forget the child hiding behind the broken cart. The way she clutched a doll made of straw and string. The way she looked at you, not like a hero, not like a monster, but like something old and useless and in the way. Your armour's polished, your blade is sharp, your title is intact, but something inside you feels broken, bent at an angle that won't straighten. You've seen war, fought in tournaments, stared down siege towers and survived the plague, but none of it unsettled you quite like the moment you realised the peasants weren't fighting you. They were fighting the world, and the only reason you weren't on their side is because you were born on the right side of the wall. You never forget the sound a bone makes when it breaks inside armour. It's not the loud cinematic crack you'd expect, it's dull, wet, like a stick snapping inside a sausage casing. You hear it as your leg bends in a way it shouldn't during a skirmish that wasn't supposed to matter. Just a simple scuffle with some bandits, they said. Just a quick ride out and back. But one wrong step, one bad roll of the ankle, and now you're on your back in the mud, staring at the sky, trying not to scream while your femur throbs like it's trying to escape. Your squire, bless his terrified soul, tries to help, but he's shaking too hard to undo your greaves. By the time they get you back to the castle, your leg is twice its normal size, and every bump of the cart feels like a hammer to the bone. You pray they have wine, not for a toast, for drowning the pain. Injury, it turns out, is not a temporary inconvenience. It's a life sentence served in splinters and swelling. You're a knight. Your value is tied to your body, to how well you swing a sword, stay in a saddle, walk in straight lines. And now, you can't even get out of bed without biting your tongue and clutching the mattress like it's about to float away. The castle's physician, who is also the cook's brother, and maybe also a blacksmith in his spare time, arrives with a wooden box full of rusty instruments and zero sympathy. He pokes, prods, and finally nods like he's just solved a complex riddle. "It's broken," he says, as if that wasn't already obvious from your screaming. "We'll splint it." You ask about healing time. He shrugs. Could be months, could be never. Then he pours wine on your leg, not to clean it, just to distract you, hands you a stick to bite, and starts yanking the bones into place. You do not remember much after that. Let's take a moment for a brutal historical reality. Medieval medicine was, charitably, a mess. Knowledge of anatomy was sketchy at best. Pain relief? A strong drink and a stronger prayer. Sanitation? Non-existent. Surgeons used the same tools for everyone, and sometimes wiped them on their tunic between patients, if you were lucky. Recovery was a gamble, infection was a regular guest, and if the bone didn't heal straight, too bad. Hope you enjoy limping heroically for the rest of your days. You spend the next several weeks bedridden. Your armour gathers dust. Your sword stays sheathed. You lie on a straw mattress staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the stones. Time stretches like taffy. Days blur. Pain becomes your new companion, sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, always there. The worst part isn't the agony, it's the stillness. You're used to movement, to clashing steel, to action. Now your body is a prison, and your mind is a riot. Visitors come, some mean well, they bring broth and awkward jokes. Others come to gawk, to see the once great knight laid low by something as stupid and small as a slippery hill. You force smiles, crack jokes. But inside you feel it, the dread, that this isn't just a break, that this could be the beginning of the end. You try to stay involved. You bark orders from bed, review patrol routes. You even hold a dagger during meetings just to feel armed. But everyone knows you're sidelined. A knight who can't ride or fight is just a man with expensive laundry. Here's a little known fringe fact. Some knights who suffered serious injuries ended up joining religious orders, not necessarily out of piety, but because it was the only place where a broken warrior could still serve. Monasteries became retirement homes for the maimed. You'd trade your sword for a quill, your shield for a psalter, and pray your handwriting impressed the abbot. That thought creeps into your mind more often now. You picture yourself in robes, hobbling through cold cloisters, copying Latin texts you can barely understand. It's not the worst fate, but it's not your fate. Not yet. You're determined to recover, so you start moving, slowly, painfully. You grit your teeth and swing your legs off the bed. You fall. You try again. You walk with a cane. You try stairs. You curse stairs. Eventually you manage to take a few steps in the courtyard, under your own power, before collapsing back onto a bench and pretending you were just enjoying the view. And then comes the day you try to train again. You strap on light armour, heart pounding. You pick up a wooden practice sword just to feel the weight again. You swing. The pain shoots up your leg like fire. You drop the sword. You sit down. You cry, not out of pain, but out of rage. Here's the academic debate, by the way. Some historians argue that knights were more resilient than we give them credit for, that they trained through injury, adapted, found new ways to fight. Others say that a serious injury was the end of a knight's career. No more glory, no more charges. Just quiet decay in the corners of a castle. You refuse to believe that. You're not done. You may be limping, your leg may be a splintered disaster, but you're still a knight, and if you can't fight like before, you'll learn to fight differently. You pick up a mace. It's heavier, slower, but more forgiving. You adjust your stance, you shift your weight, you adapt. The pain doesn't go away, but you learn to live around it, to use it as fuel. You're not faster anymore, but you're smarter, more controlled. You stop trying to be the knight you were. You become something else. One day, a younger knight challenges you to a friendly bout in the yard. He's fast, arrogant, eager. You let him dance, let him swing. Then you catch him off guard with a sudden step forward and a blow to his shield that knocks him flat. The yard erupts in cheers. You help him up. He grins through his embarrassment, and you realise you're still dangerous. You're not the knight you were before the break, but maybe, just maybe, you're better. You've healed more or less. You're mobile again, if mobile includes a constant limp, a knee that clicks like a rusty hinge, and a thigh that goes numb when it rains. You've returned to your duties, your training, even the occasional patrol, but something's different now, not just in your body, but in the way you see everything. Life as a knight isn't a parade of epic battles and noble deeds. Most days it's the same handful of dull tasks performed over and over until someone bleeds or something catches peer. Because here's the dirty truth no bard ever sings. Most of your life as a knight is boredom. Not heroic, stoic, romanticised boredom, just bone-dry, mind-numbing monotony. You spend hours in the courtyard, sparring with the same three guys who all have slightly different methods of pretending they're not just swinging sticks at each other until lunch. You run patrols that never turn up anything more dangerous than a drunk miller. You inspect the guard rotations like you're solving a mystery, even though everyone's doing exactly what they did yesterday. You wake up early, stretch your sore limbs, strap on your gear, and go through the motions. Sword drills, shield drills, horse drills. Sometimes when you're feeling bold, you try spear drills, just to spice things up. Then you eat, clean your armour, nod respectfully to people you've already spoken to that morning, and try to pretend the castle walls aren't closing in. The worst part, you can't even complain. Being a knight is supposed to be the dream. You're the envy of every peasant boy with a stick and a wild imagination. You wear armour. You ride a horse. You have a title. But they don't see the aching joints, the endless duties, or the existential dread that creeps in when you realise your life has become one long, armoured Tuesday. And just when you're sure the boredom will finally bore a hole through your skull, chaos. It always comes out of nowhere. A fire in the stables, a merchant's wagon attacked near the woods, a message from the borderlands, and suddenly everything explodes into panic. Armour is strapped on in a rush, horses are saddled, half-fed and angry, orders are barked, squires are tripping over themselves. You go from half asleep to charging into danger in the span of an hour. The shift is whiplash. One day, you're arguing about whether the grain stores are being measured properly. The next, you're in a mirage surrounded by enemies you didn't even know existed, desperately trying to remember whether you were supposed to flank left or right. The first blow lands. The first scream rings out. And then, it's just muscle memory. Terror. And the kind of tunnel vision that makes you forget your own name. You fight. You bleed. You win. Maybe. Or you retreat. Either way, by sunset, you're back in the castle, armour dented, blood drying on your surcoat, ears ringing. You sit in the great hall, staring into a cup of wine you're too tired to drink, and realise it's only been 12 hours since you were arguing with the steward about the cabbage budget. Here's a harsh historical truth. Knights didn't spend most of their time fighting. Battles were rare, expensive and chaotic. The vast majority of your knightly career is spent preparing for fights that may never come, and then scrambling like a cornered squirrel when one finally does. Fringe, fact, for flavour. Some knights developed elaborate personal rituals just to break up the boredom, carving dice from animal bone, writing terrible poetry, creating new combat forms that involved balancing on barrels or fighting blindfolded. One particularly inventive knight apparently trained a chicken to peck at intruders. It never worked, but the chicken was given its own corner in the barracks. And the scholarly debate, was the knightly life fulfilling or just glorified servitude with a shiny helmet? Some argue that the repetition, the daily discipline, the strict code, gave knights a sense of structure and meaning. Others say it was just a prettier prison, with the trappings of nobility masking the fact that knights were, more often than not, just highly armed errand boys for the aristocracy. You start to feel it yourself, that creeping sense that you're not actually building anything. You're maintaining, waiting, surviving. Every battle is followed by more patrols, every victory by more duty. You hold your sword and you wonder, is this it? Is this all it ever is? You're not alone in thinking this. One night around the fire, an older knight, Sir Tybalt, grey at the temples, scar across his nose, leans over and mutters, it's either boredom or terror, never in between. You nod, and he smiles grimly. If it's quiet too long, you start to wish for something to happen, then something happens, and you wish for quiet again. You start measuring time not in days or seasons, but in events. That happened after the barn fire. Wasn't that before the bridge collapsed? Oh, that was right after Sir Dunstan fell off the wall while drunk. Your calendar becomes a list of barely managed disasters and the occasional good meal. And yet somehow you keep showing up. You keep training, you keep riding out. You sharpen your weapons, polish your armour and nod through the sermons, because despite the boredom, the monotony, the waiting, you know this much. When chaos comes, it really comes. And when it does, they'll look to you. So you endure. You sit through another tedious feast. You nod along as the steward explains week quotas. You ride out with the same patrol group you've seen every day for months. And when the distant horn sounds, or the messenger arrives pale and shaking, or someone screams from the battlements that riders approach, you'll rise from your bench, strap on your armour, and once again become what they need. A knight. Bored, bruised, half broken, but zeddy. Because between the boredom and the terror, someone has to hold the line. No one tells you about the mud. Not in the stories, not in the ballads, and certainly not in the recruitment speeches your Lord's Herald gave when you were a squire, wide-eyed and easily impressed by shiny armour and tales of honour. But once you've been on campaign long enough, you realise there's a quiet, insidious enemy no blade can slay, no prayer can ward off, and no strategy can outwit. The earth itself. And when it rains, the earth wins. You're riding through a low valley, the sky sulking above you, and clouds bloated and waiting. Your horse stumbles for the third time in 10 minutes, hooves slipping on a path that was once a road and now resembles wet bread. You dismount to walk, boots sinking with every step. your greaves caked with a thick, heavy sludge that pulls like it's trying to keep you. And then it happens. One foot sinks too deep, you try to pull it out, your other foot sinks, you tip sideways, flail, and fall straight into the muck like a sack of spoiled flour. The men laugh. You don't blame them. You would laugh too, if you weren't now lying face first in cold, sour-smelling mud, armour weighing you down, pride already halfway to drowning. You try to rise, but your arm's stuck and your sword hilt is buried somewhere beneath your own hip. You are, in every possible sense, stuck, like a beetle flipped on its back, only with more chafing. Your squire rushes over to help, half concerned, half trying not to smirk. It takes 3 people and a rope to get you upright again. Your boots make a squelch that echoes across the trees. You say nothing, just stand there, dripping, heavy, and deeply aware of how much you hate every element of this profession right now. And then the rain starts. Not a drizzle, not a gentle mist, no. This is full sky betrayal. Sheets of cold water hammer down, drenching you instantly, slipping through the seams of your armour, pooling in your boots. Your gambeson absorbs it like a sponge. You feel every drop. It runs down your back, under your breastplate, into places it has no right to go. You march on because there's no shelter, no turning back, and your commander refuses to stop for anything less than death or divine intervention. By midday, the road has turned into a river of sludge, and your horse refuses to move forward. You try leading him. He plants his hooves and looks at you with the same energy you're feeling. Absolutely not. You slip again. This time you manage to catch yourself, but your shoulder twists painfully, and you spend the next hour gritting your teeth, pretending you're fine. Now here's the real kicker. Your armour, soaked through, now weighs even more. Steel was never light to begin with, but waterlogged padding and mud-caked joints push it to unbearable levels. Every step feels like hauling a corpse strapped to your back. Your thighs burn, your knees wobble. You haven't felt your toes in an hour, and then you see it. The stream crossing. A shallow trickle on a dry day, sure. But after all this rain, it's in a brown churning mess. The footbridge is gone, washed away. What's left are the slick stones beneath, and your choices are go round 5 miles out of your way, or cross it. Guess which option your commander picks? You try to protest. He glares. You shut up. One by one, the men begin crossing. Some on foot, some leading their horses. You wait your turn, heart pounding. When it's time, you step in and immediately slip on a mossy rock and plunge waist deep into water so cold it resets your soul. You try to scramble up. Your foot's stuck again. Of course it is. The current tugs at your leg. Your armour drags you down, and for a terrifying moment, you're not a knight. You're just a man in metal, sinking into a nameless stream in a nowhere corner of the world. No enemies. No war. Just gravity and poor footwear choices. It takes 2 men to haul you out. They lay you on the bank, coughing, gasping, soaked and silent. You lie there for a moment, staring at the sky, which has decided to brighten now that your dignity has been fully extinguished. Thanks. Here's a hard historical truth. Many knights drowned. Not in battle, not in glorious charges, but because they slipped into rivers, swamps, or even moats in full armour and couldn't get back up. Armour doesn't float, and once you're down, unless someone hauls you out fast, you're a metal statue with lungs full of regret. Fun fringe fact. Some knights had to be hoisted onto their horses with cranes, literal mechanical devices, because their armour was so heavy and restrictive. Imagine needing a team of engineers just to get out of bed in the morning. That's not chivalry, that's construction. There's a scholarly argument too about whether full-plate armour was as dangerous in water as legends claim. Some say it's exaggerated. Armour was more mobile than people think. Others point to archaeological evidence of drowned knights still locked in their gear centuries later. Either way, you're now officially part of the debate, and your boots are squelching so loudly you can't hear your own thoughts. The rest of the march is silent. Your comrades are too tired to joke now. Everyone's wet. Everyone's miserable. One man is crying softly. You don't judge him. You think about joining him, but your teeth are chattering too hard. By nightfall, you reach camp. No fires, too wet, no tents lost in the river. You find a tree stump, collapse beside it, and peel off your gloves, only to discover your fingers are wrinkled and pale like old onions. You try to sleep, but you're too cold, too sore, too aware that if you ever see another puddle again, you might scream. And yet, come morning you'll do it again, because nights don't get weather delays. You rise, grit your teeth, and step back into the mud. You always do. The nights are the worst. Daylight brings at least some distraction. Marching, drilling, the occasional minor skirmish. Night is just cold, wet, and full of noises that were never meant to be catalogued by the human brain. The castle creaks, the wind howls, a distant dog barks at nothing. Rats scuttle in the walls. Somewhere someone is snoring in a way that sounds like a dying goat, and you're lying there, armour half stripped, wondering if sleep is even possible anymore. You try, you really do. You pull the furs tight around your shoulders, curl into the straw mattress that smells faintly of last week's stew, and close your eyes. But the mind doesn't shut down. It reviews every sword swing, every pratfall into mud, every terrifying peasant revolt, every moment of humiliation and near death you've endured. The plague, the crusades, jousting tournaments where your opponent fell on your lance, every scheme echoes in the quiet of the stone walls, and you feel them all in your chest, one by one. Then there's the dripping. The castle isn't waterproof. Rain seeps through cracks, through shutters, through ceilings, landing on your blanket with a rhythm that could drive anyone mad. You move to avoid it, only to find another drop falling in its place. You curse softly under your breath. It's only a drop of water, and yet it's louder than any trumpet in the world. You lie there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if maybe someone upstairs is intentionally targeting you. You dream, or maybe hallucinate, that the castle is alive. The walls are closing in. The wind whispers insults. The rats are plotting a coup. Even the stone floor feels sentient, cold and judging. You wake up several times, heart racing, convinced something has moved in the dark. It hasn't, but that doesn't make you feel any safer. Here's a historical fact. Castles were designed for defence, not comfort. Cold, damp, drafty and infested with vermin, they were survival machines. Knights spent years trying to make them tolerable, layering furs, building hearths and installing curtains to block drafts. And yet even the wealthiest could never completely conquer the cold or the noise. The walls will always win. Quirky detail, some knights resorted to absurd measures for warmth. Hot stones wrapped in rags, boiling water bottles tucked into furs. A few went so far as to wear multiple layers of chainmail beneath their tabards while sleeping, mostly because they were convinced it would ward off evil spirits, or simply because they were too stubborn to admit the cold was unbearable. Spoiler, it didn't help. The scholarly debate, as always, rages quietly in dusty halls. How much did castle life actually break a person? Some argue it strengthened discipline, patience and fortitude. Others claim it eroded mental health, creating a generation of knights perpetually cold, sleep-deprived and on edge. You're living proof that it could be both. By midnight you're usually half asleep, half alert, trapped in a limbo of exhaustion and paranoia. Every creak and drip is amplified. You swear the wind has a voice, that the stone is whispering names, that the rats are laughing at your failures. You try to ignore it. Close your eyes. Pray. Hold your sword across your chest like it's a life raft. And then someone outside the walls screams. Maybe it's a guard, maybe it's a thief, maybe it's your imagination. Your heart leaps into your throat. You rise instantly, armour clanking in protest, and check the battlements. Nothing, just the moon glinting off wet stone and a shadow that might be a tree or a corpse. You settle back down. Try to sleep again. Try to convince yourself that as bad as this is, it's normal. That every knight has gone through nights like this. That even the legendary heroes you've heard about endured similar terrors. In some scene, without complaint. You tell yourself these walls aren't haunted. They're just stone. They're just cold. They're just relentless. By dawn, your hair is wet from condensation. Your knees ache. Your teeth chatter slightly. And yet the castle life resumes as usual. Breakfast, insections, drills, patrols. You rise again, stretch your stiff limbs, and prepare to face the day. Because if a knight can't endure the long cold nights in stone walls, what hope does he have against enemies, revolts, or the merciless world outside? And so you endure. Again. Hunger is the quietest enemy, but it's also the most persistent. You're not talking about the dramatic, trumpet-blaring kind of hunger you imagine in epic tales. No, this is the dull, gnawing ache that settles in your stomach like an uninvited guest and refuses to leave. You can't ignore it. It doesn't go away when you polish your armour or tighten your belt. It waits, patient, judgmental, constant, and when it finally speaks, it speaks in growls, cramps, and an undeniable urge to gnaw on something, anything. The castle's kitchens are a testament to medieval improvisation. You stand in line with your fellow knights and squire, staring at what passes for breakfast. A chunk of bread, some thin porridge that might have been oats, or might have been something the cook found in the corner last week, and a cup of ale masquerading as mead. It's not enough, but it will keep you from fainting while you march across the courtyard. Your sword feels lighter than your stomach, which is saying something. Sometimes you get meat, rarely. When a pig or a sheep is slaughtered, you get a piece, usually the gristle, sometimes a hunk that tastes like it's been skirting decay for days. You gnaw on it while keeping one eye on the steward, who has the uncanny ability to judge your eating technique as morally reprehensible. A wrong motion, a dropped crumb, a gasp at the flavour, and you'll hear about it for weeks. Here's a historical fact. Food for knights was always a careful balance between survival and show. You were expected to eat enough to stay strong, but not so much that it interfered with the noble image. Overeating in public was shameful. Undereating could get you dismissed from a table. Somehow both happened to you in the same week. And it's not just the quantity, the quality is a gamble. Vegetables are a rare treat unless the cook fancies you unlucky enough to taste what's been stewing too long. Bread is often hard enough to chip teeth. Ale and mead, your constant companions, are rarely safe to drink straight. Water? Forget it. The moat outside the castle is technically water, but it's mostly a soup of mud, animal droppings, and despair. Fringe fact. During long campaigns or sieges, knights sometimes resorted to creative but questionable sources of nourishment. Rats, pigeons, or even stray cats were occasionally pressed into service. Not everyone survived the experiment. You personally draw the line at rodents, but your squire isn't so squeamish, and he's still bragging about his nutritional ingenuity to anyone who will listen. There's also a scholarly debate about how much medieval diet affected performance. Some argue that knights were often undernourished compared to their idealised image in art and poetry, making exhaustion, illness, and battlefield injuries far more dangerous than in popular imagination. Others point out that high-calorie rations, bread, cheese, salted meat, kept even the most exhausted warriors functional, if not comfortable. You've learned both points the hard way. Hunger isn't just a physical problem, it's a psychological one. It gnaws at your patience, it dulls your focus. It turns the simplest task, riding, inspecting, polishing, or fighting, into a slog. You find yourself daydreaming about bread, clean water, or a proper meal more often than tactics or orders. Hunger doesn't scream, it whispers, it waits, and it punishes you for every lapse in attention. Sometimes it's communal. At feasts you watch the nobles consume plate after plate and your stomach knots as you realise the disparity between your reality and theirs. You swallow the thin porridge and try to remember that this is normal, that the same meal sustained countless nights before you, that the king's table is only a dream for peasants and aspirants. You chew slowly, savouring what's bland simply because you're alive to taste it. And yet, hunger keeps you moving. You patrol the grounds with a weight in your belly that's almost spiritual. You swing your sword, climb onto your horse, inspect the armoury, all while pretending you're full and nothing hurts. You've learned to adapt, to ignore, to push the gnawing presence to the back of your mind. But it's always there, always waiting. Eventually, you realise something. Hunger is the great equaliser. No armour protects you from it. No title shields you. No sword deflects it. You're entirely at its mercy, and surviving it day after day is its own kind of battle. By sunset, when the food is gone and the mess hall empties, you feel it again, the hollow pull in your gut, reminding you that knights might wield swords, wear armour and earn titles, but none of it buys a full belly. Hunger, relentless, patient and unforgiving, is the closest thing you've ever met to a true enemy. Exhaustion now is your constant companion, not the kind of tired that fades after a night's rest. No, this is deeper, a grinding weariness that begins in the bones, seeps into the muscles, and lodges somewhere in your brain. It's the sum of years in armour, endless drills, sleepless nights in stone halls, and campaigns across mud, sand, and plague-ravaged lands. You wake up, ache, and move because that's what a knight does. Because the alternative is worse, admitting weakness. Patrols, training, inspections, they all blur together in a haze of fatigue. You can barely lift your sword without gritting your teeth. Your horse senses it and refuses to cooperate, ears flicking at imaginary threats while dragging you toward a ditch. You stumble through the courtyard, clanking armour echoing across empty halls, feeling each rivet, each joint, each chain as if it were an additional weight pressing against your lungs. Meals provide little relief. The bread is stale, the meat fatty and undercooked, the stew thin and overspiced. You eat slowly, more out of habit than hunger, while your mind drifts to dreams of hot food, clean water and beds that don't smell faintly of wet wool. But the world doesn't pause for nostalgia. After eating, you polish your armour, check weapons, tend the horses, and pray for a moment of quiet that never comes. Here's a historical fact. Chronic exhaustion was as deadly as sword wounds in medieval campaigns. Knights collapsed from fatigue, became easy targets, or fell ill because their bodies simply couldn't recover from the relentless demands of armour, long marches, and lack of proper nutrition. And there's no modern medical equivalent to tell you why it's happening. You either endure or you die. Fringe fact. Some particularly superstitious knights believed exhaustion could invite malevolent spirits. They carried charms, recited prayers mid-patrol, or slept with amulets under their armpits. Some even slept sitting on their swords to ward off fatigue demons. It didn't help. At all. The scholarly debate surrounding knightly exhaustion centres on how much it shaped medieval warfare. Some historians argue it was a hidden determinant of battle outcomes. Armies could be defeated not by strategy but because tired knights moved too slowly, reacted too late, or simply collapsed mid-charge. Others suggest it was glorified, a kind of endurance test that distinguished the true knight from the merely privileged. You, lying awake at night with muscles screaming, think it's a bit of both. Exhaustion shapes your decisions. You hesitate before charging a hill, second-guessing every movement because your legs have forgotten how to obey. You miss opportunities in skirmishes. You forget the exact number of arrows on a bow rack. Even the simplest calculations, how many paces to the wall, how much wine remains in the barrel, become mental gymnastics, and your mind doesn't rest. It runs through every campaign, every duel, every mistake, in a loop that refuses to stop. It's not just physical. The fatigue infiltrates your emotional state. Patience disappears. Minor irritations flare into anger. Humour becomes thin and biting. You lash out at squires who weren't even in the wrong. You snap at servants who are just trying to help. You grumble, mutter, and curse the universe in ways you never imagined. Exhaustion doesn't just weaken your body, it erodes your humanity, quietly day by day. And yet you persist. Because in a knight's life there is no alternative. Sleep is often stolen, rest is brief, and comfort is a mirage. You strap on armour, wield a sword, and ride out again. The courtyard is your endless treadmill, the training yard your cage, the horizon, a line you chase without ever reaching. Every day is a test of endurance, patience, and sheer willpower. By nightfall, when your muscles throb and your eyelids feel like lead, you curl onto a straw mattress, pulling furs tight around your shoulders. You close your eyes and drift, only to awaken hours later, stiff, and ready to begin the cycle again. There is no end, only tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Exhaustion is a blade without a hilt. You cannot fight it, cannot escape it, and yet somehow you survive. And then there's death, unavoidable, unpredictable, and surprisingly mundane. You spend your life swinging swords, charging into chaos, dodging arrows, and yet the thing that eventually gets most knights isn't a heroic duel or a dramatic battlefield end. It's illness, accident, or sheer misfortune. A rotten loaf, a misjudged step in the path, a misfiring trebuchet. You realise with a quiet horror that the stories you grew up on, full of glory, honour and poetry, rarely match the way most knights actually leave the world. Death lurks in every corner of castle life, every march through muddy fields, every skirmish in the woods. One day it's the steward struck by a falling timber. The next, a squire succumbs to a fever no prayer can cure. During a patrol you glimpse a horse stumble into a ditch, throwing both rider and steed into a heap of splintered wood. You recognise the shape of human frailty more clearly than any enemy's sword. And yet you continue, because stopping is not an option. There is always someone counting on you to move, to patrol, to enforce, to survive. Here's a historical reality check. The average life expectancy of a knight wasn't much higher than that of a peasant once you account for battle deaths, disease, and accidents. Some lived into their 50s, even 60s if they were lucky, cautious and largely bored. Many more died young, anonymous and forgotten outside the occasional local chronicle. It's a sobering fact for anyone imagining knighthood as a ladder to eternal fame. Quirky side note, some knights developed elaborate rituals to cope with the omnipresence of death. Carrying charms, reciting prayers before every meal, sleeping with a dagger under the pillow, or even holding mock funerals for themselves in quiet corners of the castle. One particularly creative knight reportedly kept a miniature skeleton in his armour chest, polishing it alongside his weapons, claiming it reminded him to fight as if already dead. Morbid, yes, but strangely practical in a profession built around risk. And there's the scholarly debate. Were knights heroic or just fortunate? Some historians argue that knightly culture and the chivalric code instilled a sense of duty that allowed men to perform extraordinary acts of courage. Others point out that survival often depended on luck, social status, and proximity to wealth, rather than skill or virtue. In other words, many knights weren't paragons of morality. They were simply trying not to die in mud, blood, or plague. And sometimes that's as heroic as it gets. You've witnessed enough death to understand its subtleties. It is quiet, sudden, and often absurdly anticlimactic. A man falls in the ditch, another trips on a stair, a horse bites, a bolt misfires. It rarely conforms to expectation, rarely follows narrative logic, and never gives warnings. And yet, for all its randomness, you begin to see it as part of the rhythm of life in this world. Unpredictable, constant, and humbling. Death also teaches respect, oddly enough. You see how fragile life is, how precarious your balance on this earth really is. Every swing of your sword, every march in mud, and every sleepless night in a cold stone room becomes infused with a strange urgency. You fight harder, you train smarter, you drink less of the vile ale at feasts. You watch your companions more closely, knowing that one misstep could erase years of experience in an instant. There is a bitter poetry in it. The life of a knight is not just battles, tournaments, or chivalric ideals. It is waking up every day, carrying metal on your back, leather on your hands, steel in your grip, and stepping into a world that could end you at any moment. And if you survive, you do it all again. If you don't, at least your story, misery, grit, blood, and all, joins the anonymous chorus of knights who came before. As you sit, armoured and weary, staring at the flickering torchlight in the hall, you understand something fundamental. Knightly life is not glorious. It is not heroic in the way bards sing. It is a relentless cycle of fear, discomfort, responsibility, and resilience. You realise that survival is itself an achievement, that enduring is its own form of valour. You have lived, and that is your victory. And with that understanding, you finally allow yourself a rare exhale. Tomorrow will bring more drills, more patrols, more mud, more exhaustion. But tonight, you simply exist. A knight who has fought, suffered, survived, and learned the hard truth about every facet of his life.